that suggestion at the top of page 2, and how will it improve things?
Well, you know, with the infrastructure, not the infrastructure, the construction of the mine, having very high batters with access to various levels, the batter height is still pretty immense. So to effectively fight a fire in specific spots there, it's very useful to have what would generally be described as an aerial appliance. So they come in several forms. You know, they come telebooms, aerial pumpers. You know, I'm not fully across all of the technical names, but they fit into this category that is a long reach equipment that can give them access more readily, would be the best way of describing it.
And this is the type of equipment that, when it did arrive during this fire, proved to assist the fighting of the fire.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a defining moment, if you like, when you get that type of appliance on site. And it's probably worth noting that when the fire was coming to an end and there was a handover back to our own resources, that they kept an aerial appliance at the Morwell Brigade for a period of time after that, having recognised the view of it. I put in the text there, CAFs may be regarded in that category, but I would have to defer to whatever the fire authority thought was the most appropriate thing to have available.
Next, you refer to fire-specific training, or fire training specific to the Hazelwood mine. And as I read the red text, it's an offer that you'll give some enhanced training. Your mine will provide training to the CFA. What did you have in mind, and how will that change things as we saw them develop during this fire?
Yeah, look, we've had a relationship directly with the Morwell group, as we would call it, consisting of the Morwell Brigade and other smaller brigades within the area. In fact, the last set of training we did with them was actually in December 2013, and there's 4 more training sessions already planned. But what became apparent is that on an event of this scale, you obviously get more than just the local brigades in there, and obviously we can't cater for all eventualities. But there did appear to be some gaps in the training that we do with them as well. So we've laid out here a pretty extensive view of the types of things it would cover around orientation, around location of the infrastructure within the mine. I think primarily at the moment it has been about fighting fires in the mine as opposed to complete knowledge of the mine, you know, locations, if you like. Knowledge of our emergency response procedures, more knowledge of the command structure, about the communications. And those types of things are mentioned there because as part of the evidence that came up, there was issues across all of those areas to varying degrees throughout the exercise. The other thing that we're actually seeing in there is obviously subject to the view of the CFA of what is appropriate or what's not appropriate. We would be willing to interface and impart training on the local issues with whatever amount of resource is viewed to be, I guess, doable. Mm-hmm. We've put the 25-kilometre radius. I don't know whether that's the right or wrong thing. That effectively pulls in Traralgon, but again, it would depend on what is said there in the offer, and we currently do. Not just limited to the CFA, and we do it now. We know we have the SES, we have VicPol and those things, so we're more than willing, because we obviously realise that all these people are here to help us, so the more we can interface with them beforehand, the better.
The next refers to the command structure, and we've heard evidence in the proceedings from Mr Dugan and others about what the structure was on the day. Yep. But what are you suggesting here in terms of what will be new and how will it help?
Yeah. Look, emergency response structures in power plants throughout the world are very similar, and power plants and mines, from our perspective, it's based around an emergency commander, although the name differs in different parts of the world, who is a person on shift. So their 24-hour coverage is there. They are always the first line of defence in an incident. They always take it up. And then, depending on escalation and time frame, the responsibility is passed to someone else. And that was what actually happened on this event. What we're now seeing in light of the extreme conditions on the day, we're actually seeing that with the liaison that will go through from the Phoenix modelling and the other interaction, we agree that relying on the structure that is there in terms of the personnel on the day, that's maybe not as appropriate as it could be, because we could put a mechanism in place that says we will nominate in advance what the structure will be. We will accelerate it to the next level as a minimum, so that on the notified extreme fire danger days, we'll already have it in place and we'll already have the people on site.
And I think you also make the point, you'll notify the CFA of the precise identity and contact details of those people. So am I correct in understanding that rather than telling the CFA next week, when we have a fire, we'll have an emergency commander, you'll do that, but in addition, when there is a threat of fire or a day of extreme fire danger, you will contact the CFA and say, tomorrow our commander is Mr X, the following date's Mr Y, etc., so that they have those details?
Yes, absolutely. We want to set the liaison up as early as possible.
Now, moving down to additional fire personnel, it's a row in red that refers to on extreme fire days, Hazelwood will ensure more personnel are rostered. Explain what additional suggestion you're making there and how you regard it as addressing any shortcomings from the past.
Again, this is about we have a dedicated fire service team, and actually having looked historically at what fire services teams consisted of in the past, we've actually got more coverage today in the current setup than we actually had 20 years ago within fire services. Different structure, but the actual coverage, number of personnel available for those duties, engaged in those duties, is actually better coverage through longer in the day. However, what we're also recognising is that when we have specified events based on the information that is now becoming available via the modelling, via the interaction, then most certainly we'll arrange to increase that resource. So we've suggested we would double the resource. Part of the reasoning around that is, I think we touched on it before, is that we do understand that the CFA may be committed at different times to different events and more stretched than others. So we would look to liaise there to what support was available for them, and that could influence the outcome.
So can I ask, by way of example, if during that liaison the CFA told you we are fully stretched on the other side of Traralgon, that might influence you to decide to crew up to double the normal amount in light of that indication?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Look, all it would do in terms of it, we would certainly increase the number, irrespective of whether they were available or not. We can go to doubling the number. That's not an issue. Depending on if there was no other issues in all of the other areas, we might choose that some of the additional numbers might be more standby than physically there, but we would have them available, and in the event could get them there. But we will double the number if there was any indication that that was the correct thing to do, and that's part of the linkage to what I mentioned before. That when they send the modelling, I would envisage that there would potentially be room for comments there about from the CFA that says what is expected of us. They could potentially give us some guidance to how things might unfold.
Now, I think the next point about signage is fairly self-explanatory, probably fits in with the orientation training. You'll upgrade the signage just to make some of those issues easier for people who come for the first time. So let's move to power supply.
Interrupt to
yes.
Whether that might be extended to include specifically firefighting maps. In other words, just to have a map that is geared not only for people coming from outside, so it won't be needed internally, but those that are specifically firefighting facilities on a particular map that ties in with that signage.
And look, because the maps will be available as part of the orientation and the training, so it's a natural extension that we could make them available most certainly.
And Mr. Brown, could I also ask whether have you run these initiatives and suggestions past anyone at the CFA?
No, we have not. And that is why I guess there's a caveat in the beginning that says these are suggestions from ourselves that people may wish to take up or not. But my view would be that in terms of what I've heard in the hearing, and I haven't heard it all, it was that there were things that have been talked about as being viewed as being advantageous. But the first time representatives for the CFA saw them was the same as yourselves yesterday.
And have you explored these ideas more widely with the members of other infrastructure, other mines in the Latrobe Valley or other areas of large infrastructure?
No, I have not.
The next topic doesn't relate to something that Hazelwood can offer itself. It's a suggestion about provision of power supply. Mr. Graham, why do you make this suggestion, accepting that it's not something you do or you control, but why have you made this suggestion?
Well, I think we've heard on many occasions the impact that loss of supply had on the firefighting activity. So it's obviously an area that we need to focus on much more closely. And having focused on it and given it a bit of thought, there are actually several suggestions within the black text which relates to SP AusNet, and then in the red text to follow relating to ourselves, that we feel can substantially increase the redundancy within the system and markedly reduce the likelihood of sustaining power failures anywhere near the magnitude that we suffered on that particular day.
These two suggestions, redundancy in power supply and then the next row, enhanced redundancy of power supply, are they both matters that you took some advice from the mine's electrical engineers on?
Yes, most certainly. Because these were the guys that were involved on the day with SP AusNet in trying to re-energise the supplies. And part of the issue is that basically you have an overhead line that is supplying both to the north of the mine, the MWN, and to the west of the mine, the MWW. So what actually happens is there is a line that's coming in, and forgive me going back to drama in school, I guess, but when the line comes in, it splits like this. So it goes off to the north and off to the west. And we have duplicated lines. So the suggestion is, so if this leg has a fault, it trips the supply to the whole circuit coming from down in the floor here. So you lose all the supply. You have to identify where the fault is. You have to physically get up and disconnect conductors to then put back in service the healthy supply. This suggestion is very simple. This is basically fitting offload isolators. So where the line comes in and splits into the two, you can get very simple devices, like knife switches we call them, up in the pole. So you can easily, if this is the side that tripped you, you can remotely, or SP AusNet can remotely just drop this down. So it's very quick. You drop that down, you re-energise to put the supply up this leg. And within that system, from the 66 kV, there is duplicate lines. So you've got it coming in and going out two, in and out two again. So that's actually almost, you could say that's actually 4 separate circuits. If one trips, you can get it in quite quickly, back on the other one, and in the meanwhile, you've still got 2 supplies from the other part. So that's actually a very major step forward to what we feel is not a whole lot of work to do.
And this is a matter that you'll need to take up initially with SP AusNet?
Yes, certainly.
The next row where the topic changes is fire risk mitigation, vegetation, and you refer to initiating a program for reduction of vegetation in the worked out areas of the Northern Batters. Why do you suggest that, and what will that offer?
Sorry, could I just bring you back to power supply?
Yes.
It's just we've talked about the 66 kV, which is the SP AusNet part of things. But in the main, we've got the 66 kV. As I've said, we can increase the redundancy on that system there. But actually, there are also 2 other independent sources of supply that can be made available to the mine. One is actually from a 22 kV system, which we did use on the day after some work on it. There is a temporary transformer there that we're suggesting, which is fed by an underground cable, that we're suggesting that SPOSNet should do a feasibility study of, looking to upgrade it from a temporary to a permanent standard.
Yes.
So that we could utilise that. If they did that, then we can couple in from this transformer into our MWW system. So again, that would be an enhancement from a 22 kV independent system. And then finally, there is actually also another supply from an 11 kV system through MWE, again, which has capability of supplying the clean and dirty water pump system to some degree.
So if all of these things were done, you would have a number of layers of redundancy.
Yeah, certainly. And the beauty of it is, you know, the 22 kV system, it doesn't hang off the 66 kV system. They come from separate independent supplies. So a fault in a specific area external to the power plant on a substation, for an example, wouldn't take everything out.
Now moving to vegetation, why do you propose that the introduction of that program, and what will it offer?
Look, we recognise that there's things being said about vegetation and the obligations about vegetation external to the mine, but recognise that the presence of vegetation on those slopes is not desirable, and we've seen that it increases risk. So we would look to be clearing the northeastern part of the northern batters certainly before the fire season starts, and put in a programme to then continue along the rest of the northern batters and clear them of that vegetation.
Next is a reference to pipe work, and first of all you talk about the new pipes that were put in during the fire, and then you go on to talk about additional pipes. I think to understand this aspect we also need to bring up the map which was attached, or is now part of the exhibit. Is it possible to bring up the one-page coloured map? If not, I know the tribunal members have a hard copy of it. Here it is. Just explain what you're suggesting by reference to that map, if you can, Mr. Graham.
Yes, you'll actually see on the map. Oh, here's the magic. You'll actually see on the map there. That's the northeastern end of the northern batters. What it's actually depicting there is the green areas. That's areas that have been previously rehabilitated. The blue areas on here, these are the area, the blue cross-hatched areas. These are the areas that are scheduled to be rehabilitated before the end of this year. Mm-hmm. And then the yellow areas that are in there, they're actually depicting, just for completeness, they're actually depicting land that is virgin land. Let's say it's undisturbed land, so it's not coal. It's essentially where overburden would have been previously. What happened during the fire? All of the blue pipework there, we put that in to assist accelerating the putting out of the fire. So we put a lot of pipework into that area. Now the pipework's in that area, we would not wish to remove it. We would look to utilise it and leave it there and maintain it for the future. Additional to that, however, we've identified that the system could be enhanced by including additional pipework, which is actually the top dotted line, which is on level 1.
So the broken line, it's also in blue, but the broken line is what you're saying in your red text.
Yes.
This is what we will add.
Yes.
If we go back to your chart,
Yeah.
and look at page 5, you then say this will have the effect that the area shown, and this is the area shown in the map, is covered by those dot points that are listed there.
Yes.
I want to ask you about the next 2 dot points, though. You say we'll conduct a review and then we'll pass the outcome of the review on. What will this review do? What will it look at?
Yes. Look, very much aware that there's been a lot said about options about rehabilitated areas or areas sufficiently covered by water sprinkler systems. So in the Northern Batters, concentrating on that initially, we've put pipework in. We will put more pipework in to enhance the system because that is the area that is more vulnerable to impact on the local community of Morwell. We concentrate on that first. However, it would only be right that we need to conduct a review of the rest of the firefighting system. We would use external consultants to do that, to have a look at what pipework we've got there, what the condition of that pipework is, and what the suitability of purpose it is. Having done that, the outcome of the review, we would make it known to DSDBI and Victoria Work Cover Authority.
Next, you referred to use of that system. On extreme fire danger days, Hazelwood will instigate wetting down of non-operational areas. So that is something that previously wasn't the practice. Why are you suggesting changing that?
Well, again, listening to evidence from people from what happened before. Sometimes you learn from the past. Practices happened for some reasons. They change. We shouldn't ignore what was deemed to be effective previously. We would look to do it because we need to move the focus away through the events we've had from a very high focus on the operational areas to a more global focus on the risk to the whole mine.
Next, you talk about planning and communication in relation to fire, and the first topic is integrated fire management planning. I take it that these suggestions come from hearing what representatives of the council have to say, but what's your suggestion about improving planning, working with the council?
Yeah, correct. It is from hearing of the existence. Personally, I didn't know this organisation or this municipal fire plan existed, and that we weren't engaging with it. Certainly, we will re-establish engagement. But what we're also seeing there, of course, for something of this nature, this is not just about how ourselves can benefit from this organisation. Obviously, we would suggest that any essential infrastructure, any other areas of critical infrastructure, and any other stakeholder in these types of issues should be involved as part of that. So stretching from people like plantation owners, the paper mill, all of it to
and the other miners in the valley, I assume.
Oh, certainly.
Then the next row you talk about communication, and you talk about people being at the ICC from your organisation. Why do you suggest that the mine should have someone over at the ICC?
Well, the ICC is with it being the Incident Control Centre, that's where the knowledge sits in terms of what is going on in the locality, how stretched the resources are, whether they're physically. How I saw it was that as part of the initial interaction, right from the start of the Phoenix mapping, the interaction may result in a call to come to the ICC as an example. I'm not necessarily suggesting on all extreme fire danger days we knock on the door and we go in. It would be more an iterative process about I guess what's applicable at the time. We're not wishing to impose, if the ICC's got other issues. But so the two things are linked together. I think a lot of them are interlinked.
Community engagement you talk about next, and you suggest that there be a review conducted, and then you point to what Hazelwood's part in that would be. What is this review aimed at generating? What improvements do you want to see in community engagement?
Look, community engagement's, I guess, an interesting area. In fact, interesting is not the right word. If there's one regret I've got around this incident, it's about the community engagement from a GDF Suez perspective. Most certainly, we've always acknowledged that the incident controller is the one consistent voice that would engage with the community and we would supply information to them. Most certainly through that approach, I think it was the wrong outcome, because it portrayed that GDF Suez did not care about the community. That's absolutely as far away from the truth as you could actually get, because we understand that the community actually is very, very close to us. Part of the reason we want a sustainable business at Hazelwood is because we know we're a big employer in the community. We know that the community thrives on Hazelwood being here. So the last thing we would want to do is adversely impact the community. But it didn't translate through that mechanism, and that's a real shame. That. So in terms of we would wish to put it right. We still obviously need to defer to the fact that the incident controller is the incident controller. He has got a lot of say in what happens. All we're really suggesting there is that for this particular event and the time the event went over, because from my personal experience, if you work in power plants, I've been involved in lots of big incidents, but normally it's a big incident in a short time frame.
Yes.
Normally it's around hours of heartache, hardly ever days. This is days gone into weeks, which actually puts in a dimension that most certainly we were not prepared for. And from what I've seen, other organisations weren't quite as prepared for either. So this would be an attempt to say it's obviously been proved this type of thing can happen. We would hope we wouldn't get anything like this happening again. But you know what they say, you should plan for the worst to some degree. So this is all about let's get our heads together before then, but recognising that the authorities, whoever they are, or the incident controller, we feel that it would be appropriate for them to run, to set up how it would operate, and we would participate in it with a view to having things like still ensuring the consistency of message. The last thing we want to do is confuse people over messaging, and I think we heard evidence from Community Witness yesterday praising Craig Lapsley there in terms of how effective it was and precise it was, but we think more can be done by involving more of the organisations up front in terms of establishing what the roles could be. So the first part of the writing in black there, that's all about identifying what we could do or what could be done. The red part in terms of Hazelwood, that's more about how are we going to do it.
Next topic is occupational health and safety. And have you heard something during this inquiry which has prompted you to think that there's room to look at that and work with the authorities differently on that?
Yeah, personally, I wasn't in the, I wasn't present for the evidence in regard to this. But I am aware that in terms of safety management, major mining hazards, looking at them, and the regulations that we're stating there, that there are gaps in terms of what is being done. So the suggestion is that if the worker authority could prepare some guidance material in relation to the requirements, then we'd be more than happy to work with them to get the conclusion that's required in light of what they suggest.
The CO protocol, there was a lot of evidence about different iterations of the protocol, different organisations having different views about it. What are you suggesting to bring that to a head and to improve it?
Well, again, in the evidence there was it's not a new thing. Certainly there was protocol movements, if you like, and it was suggested that some of the things that happened were done on the hop, and there were, as I believe it, outstanding actions from previous events around having protocols set up in advance for this. So it's saying, yes, there was obviously some gaps in there. We certainly don't want protocols to be different across organisations. Let's get together, develop the protocol up front, so that when the event happens, we've got it there. We're not trying to make up what it should be.
And once you and the CFA do your own work, it seems from the black text at the end that you're suggesting that you then involve WorkSafe in assisting the two of you to sort out whether it's up to scratch.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, they've obviously got a responsibility in this area. More than happy to be involved with them.
Now, in the next item, rehabilitation, you talk about undertaking the rehabilitation set out in Annexure 5. That's a map with some coloured in bits that was attached to Mr Faithfull's statement. So I think everyone understands that. Can you explain what you're proposing and what you suggest there about clarity in terms of future rehabilitation?
Yeah. I don't think we need to go back to the diagram, but when I was discussing the pipework, when the map was up there on the northern batters, the blue cross-hatched section was the section that's related to Annexure 5, so that is the area of rehabilitation there. It was actually news to me about ambiguity in the current work plans in terms of whether rehabilitation should be completed by or commenced from.
Are you talking there about Ms White expressed
Yes.
a certain view and Mr Faithfull said that
Yep.
hadn't been how he'd understood it? What are you going to do to sort that out?
Well, I mean, the natural thing that actually happens in terms of whenever you put a work plan variation in, there's always iterations around that variation. So now it's come to light that there's a difference potentially in what the requirement is. Then we'll have the discussions with the SDBI. We'll have them specify more clearly what the expectation is. We would talk to them about it. And look, we understand why they might say what they're saying. The discussion would need to include things around, whilst there are dates there, what the dates link to is normally availability of a suitable overburden to perform the task. So all of these things, and of course things like stability and geotechnical constraints in that area, that dictates when we'll do any of the work. But we'll go through the discussions. The SDBI is the regulator. We'll come to a conclusion and we'll agree what requires doing, and then we'll move on.
Mr Graham, that brings us to the end of your chart. Thinking about each of those subject matters that you've taken us to, is there anything that I haven't invited you to speak to in terms of lessons learned or improvements for the future that you wanted to tell the inquiry about?
I think that I think they're all very valid points. I don't expect that this is exclusively what requires doing by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's a good start as to what should be considered. And as I mentioned before, in terms of the things in red that we are able to do without the requirement for engagement with other authorities, we will commit to do. The only thing I would say is that throughout this whole process, whilst there's actually been, I guess, shortcomings in many areas across everything where things haven't been as great as they could have been, I think there was actually a fantastic effort put in from many quarters, both from the combatant authorities, the volunteers, and really appreciate it. And my main regret is to say that most certainly is the impact that we had on the local community that we would wish never to happen again, because that's very regrettable.
Thank you, Mr Graham. I'm not sure what order we're going to adopt now, whether it be Mr Rosen who will... Mr Rosen will ask some questions.
I was going to just ask a couple too. Thank
Yeah.
you. So, Mr Graham, it's very commendable that GDF Sewers and you have set out this list, and as you say, it's a good start. So, well done. And the purpose of the inquiry is to think about how we can prevent things in the future. I guess just a couple of things. As the CEO or asset manager, how would you describe the culture at GDF And do you think that it's safety or production that are the key messages that are promoted from the top?
In terms of, well, most certainly safety. Safety first, actually. The pillars, I guess, of a successful organisation are the staff. So protection of the staff is the most important. So one of the main pillars is the health and safety. And actually, that's one of the things that we're very proud of. In terms of the incident, for an incident of this length of time, spanning the 45 days, with an enormous amount of staff involved in the process, for us to have sustained one medical treatment injury, which it was actually in the first day of it, with a sprinkler hitting one of our employees in the face, in I think 4 or 5 first aid treatments, I think it's testimony to the processes and procedures that we have in place there. So I think we've actually demonstrated that we have a strong safety culture there. And whilst we're not discussing it now, if you were actually to look at statistically the performance in terms of all injury frequency rate for Hazelwood over the last 10 years, there's been a continual downward trend in terms of injuries to our employees. So we do take that very seriously.
And just to talk about, a lot's been said about risk assessments over the past few days or past few weeks. How does GDF go about conducting risk assessments?
There's lots of being an engineering organisation, I guess. There's lots of different types of risk assessments in there. We have internally, I think most of them tend to be around engineering. So we have internally things in the past called HERA, Hazelwood Engineering Risk Assessments. So we do actually assess risks in that manner. The company as a whole, in terms of previously International Power ownership or now GDF Sewers ownership, we have higher level risk assessments that are undertaken throughout the organisation, OPERA, Operational Plant Engineering Risk Assessments, so we do them. We also look in terms of the business. We actually do enterprise risk management, so we actually look at what enterprise risks the business has and what mitigations we need to put in place to ensure that these risks are reduced to an acceptable level. So there are various layers of risk assessment, and they can take many forms, whether it's use of bow tie or whatever. But I think it was said before, one of the risk assessments that was shown previously was one of the ones in its infancy. There are lots and lots of improvements being made in that area, and we use risk assessments almost on a daily basis within the power station. Anything we've got a potential issue with it. First step, straight away, risk assessment, get the appropriate qualified people for that risk or that would be impacted by it, stakeholders, and do an assessment.
And I guess the question have been asking is, was the risk of fire in the worked out matters of the mine adequately recognised by GDF?
Hindsight's a great thing, and in terms of when you actually look at the major mining hazards, which is the area that would have been covered by, because the major mining hazards is associated with the loss of one life or more, and the fact that our enterprise risk management system looks at costs to the business in terms of fire. What we have in that area identified as a risk from fire to do with coal systems, if you like, is not indeed the operating faces on the mine even, I realise your question was around the workout place. It's not even the operating phases of the mine. It's actually what we call the slot bunker, which is the central point from the coal delivery from the mine into the power plant. The reason being, a fire there will put our business, will put us out of business. So in terms of our hierarchy of risk, in terms of impact on the business, then a fire in the worked out batters does not fit in that category. And in terms of business risk, obviously we've had a huge event which is deeply regrettable, and we will ensure we won't have another event like that again. We lost production for, well, we didn't lose total production, we came down to probably 10% production for probably 24 hours. So in terms of how a business would look at risk, in the hierarchy that was there, an event of fire in the worked out batters of the mine doesn't fit in a high profile. Following the events we've had now, the question is, should it? And the answer is yes, it should. And it will. And that's part of the reason why we're making these suggestions.
Thank you. We could go on for lots more questions and ask you lots of things, but I think it's important that you've demonstrated that there are things that you'll do differently. So you've got an opportunity, and there are a number of people in this room. If you had one thing to say to the community of the Latrobe Valley, what would that be?
Well, I've actually said that in terms of, I think me personally, my experience has been around, certainly a lot of experience around emergencies of a short-term duration, with a focus on getting the event over. The fact that this event became prolonged, my personal attention, I guess, was around my internal workforce. And why I'm saying that is because we had a lot of people employed in trying to tackle the event. We had a lot of people worried about the livelihood in terms of whether the business would continue. And that aspect of it actually continues out into the community as well, because I said if the business didn't continue, then obviously it would be devastating for the local area, and we're local people. Nobody wants that to occur. Whilst my focus is there, it's absolutely regrettable that we didn't acknowledge in an earlier fashion the impact that we were having on the community. Now, in terms of when we say not acknowledge, we didn't publicly acknowledge. I accept that. What I would say, however, is that I can guarantee that all of the staff of GDF Sewers and their contractors, as well as the support from all of the agencies and volunteers, our sole purpose was to get the fire out as soon as possible. And actually the hierarchy within that was also utilising whatever techniques we could to abate the situation regarding smoke into the community as early as possible. So, getting the fire out was one thing, but trying to limit the amount of impact we were having in that area, which is exactly why we put more resources and we put a lot of pipework into the Northern Batters area, because that was the area that was causing the most impact. So I feel that in terms of physical effort to do our best for the situation and for the community, I feel we did that. I feel we didn't portray that so that people would realise, I'm afraid.
Thank you, sir.
I appear for Environment Victoria.
Yeah.
And can you hear me?
Good afternoon, yes.
Thank you. I just have a small number of questions about one area which does not appear on your chart, and I'd like to suggest to you that it is
an area that you can consider for improvement, and that is about the rehabilitation bond that your company has lodged with the Minister. And you're aware that the current rehabilitation bond is worth $15 million, is that right?
I am, yes.
And it's correct, isn't it, that GDF Suez has not been asked by the Minister at any stage to undertake an assessment of the rehabilitation liability under Section 79A of the Act, have you?
Sorry, could you say it again?
GDF Suez has not been asked by the Minister to undertake an assessment of its remediation liability under Section 79A of the Act.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yes, but you have helpfully, in the chart that you've provided to the inquiry today, made an assessment of the costs to rehabilitate the 9 hectares of land that are discussed in Annexure 5 to Mr Faithfull's statement. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And in your chart you've said that the cost of rehabilitation of the land set out in Annexure 5 is about $800,000.
Yeah, actually 995,000. It does say 800 there, though. I accept that.
All right. Well, it's a reasonable amount more.
The money I've got in the budget is 995,000.
Okay. Well, that land is it measures 9 hectares, and I'll just working on the maths that appeared in your chart. According to my calculations, that's a hectare amount of $88,000 per hectare on the basis of a $800,000 cost. And Ms Truell has just done the maths for me. If you work on the cost you've just given us, it's a hectare cost of $110,555 per hectare. That's obviously right, isn't it?
If you say the maths is correct.
Yes, and I say that because it's a 9 hectare area for rehabilitation, as is clear from the map attached to your document. Do you follow me?
Yes, I understand the hectares. I haven't done the math, but I'm listening.
Yes, all right. And just while we're there, that hectareage, the 9 hectares,
yep.
It's correct that, as Mr Faithfull has said, that area for rehabilitation was identified in January 2014, wasn't it?
I'm not aware when it was identified.
Yes.
I'm only aware that we have a budgetary amount for this year to do it, and the work was planned for this year. That's the extent of my knowledge.
All right. So if we, taking my earlier, I'll take the new figures at $110,000. I'll work with the maths that I have. I beg your pardon. So if we were to go with the amount of $88,000 per hectare. Let's take, to get some sense of the magnitude of what the rehabilitation costs might be for the rest of the mine, your counsel put to Ms White when she was being cross-examined earlier this week that there were about 1,500 hectares of land in the mine that would be disturbed throughout the whole of the life of the mine. Do you follow that?
Yes.
Yes. Now,
I don't know whether the number's correct.
Yes. Well, we're not sure. We're not sure either whether it's correct, but I'll take Ms Doyle's as being correct. And if that is understood, if one removes from that the amount of rehabilitation that's already been done, which is 431 hectares, I think Mr Faithfull says, you're left with about 1,069 hectares of land that will need to be restored on current plans. You follow?
Yes.
And if you apply the earlier figure of $88,000 per hectare to the 1,069 hectares of land that will need to be rehabilitated, the total cost of that rehabilitation is $94 million. Does that strike you as surprising?
Not necessarily. What I can do is I can tell you what I think it is.
Well, what do you think it is?
In terms of rehabilitation, well, what I would say, it's you're not potentially comparing apples with apples, of course, when you say cost per hectare to rehabilitate, because I think, as Mr Faithfull said, all depends around infrastructure, stability, what you lay back, where you get the material from.
Some areas might attract different costs.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that from privatisation in 1996 through till the end of last year, we spent in excess of $14 million on rehabilitation.
Yes, all right, but would you accept, though, that having regard to the numbers that have just been discussed, understanding that not every hectare of rehabilitation in the mine will cost the same to rehabilitate, but having a look at that, and Ms Truella's just done the maths for me on your new figures, and that would amount to a sum of $118 million, that the rehabilitation bond that has been lodged in the sum of $15 million is very obviously grossly inadequate to cover the future costs of rehabilitation, isn't it?
I don't believe that's the purpose of the rehabilitation bond, to actually cover the full cost of rehabilitation. I was present when you put the argument around that before, and I did see the excerpt from the document that you showed Mr. Faithful in terms of seeing it was a document produced by ourselves that said, it was there to not put an impact on the taxpayer. My view, I've never seen that statement before, but my view on reading that statement, I don't see it any differently. If you require a person to perform a service, it's not unusual that you would have some form of retainer that says if you do not perform that service to our satisfaction, you will forfeit that retainer. That's how I see that rehabilitation bond. And I think that's a reasonable assumption, and I think the fact that the regulator has not sought to change it in that period, bearing in mind it's not just related to Hazelwood, I believe, hasn't been sought with any other of the mines, I believe that's a reasonable assumption. But you are correct, the actual cost of doing the rehabilitation, in the numbers I've seen, are certainly not more than $100 million, but,
Not much less.
I think 81, something like that, 80 something.
All right, so you would accept, just simply on the issue of the relationship between the amount of the bond and the likely future cost of rehabilitation, that the bond is out by a very significant amount, if that comparison is drawn, isn't it?
I would say it's not fair to draw that comparison, but 15 million does not equate to 81 million, correct?
Yes. Now, do you say then that if at the end of the day, speaking hypothetically of course, if GDF Sewers has not, by the time of mine closure, completed its rehabilitation, should the state of Victoria and ultimately the Victorian taxpayer foot the bill for the clean-up?
No, not at all. That won't happen. What I would actually say is that all of the process is a dynamic process in terms of life. The plans change, the life changes. One of the things that I would say, okay, there's a name change, it's GDF Sewers now. In the Latrobe Valley, the ownership of power plants has changed several times since 1996, since privatisation. We, through National Power, International Power, and then GDF Sewers taking over the entity, we're actually the only organisation that's in here for the long haul. We're not going anywhere. So in terms of, even if there was a view that we were going somewhere, then I'm sure there's legal recourse to chase us for that money.
So what you're suggesting is that, and we are speaking hypothetically, we understand, because every projection about the future must be hypothetical.
Sure.
If GDF Sewers and its related parent entities were to decide to cease operations in the jurisdiction, say, at the end of the mining licence, and not have completely rehabilitated the mine, the Victorian government would just have to chase it and sue it for recovery of the money. Is that the position you're putting?
Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah. If GDF Sewers had not completed rehabilitation of the mine by the end of the licence period, and it decided to wind up its operations in Australia or Victoria, that the Victorian government, rather than having the security of a bond to cover the remaining clean-up costs, should just chase that money from it by suing it in the courts?
I believe that GDF sewers would not allow that to happen, and we would fully meet the commitments that are required of the organisation.
If that is the case, then why do you not accept that the rehabilitation bond should be equivalent to the future costs of clean-up, particularly given that you have already estimated them?
I think that's not actually a question for me. I don't set the bond. We're not involved in setting the bond. I think you should ask the regulator as to the principle behind the bond and clarify it with them.
Yes, but the Minister is able, under the Act, to ask your company to assess its liability, and it sounds as though it can readily do that. Accepting that, if the Minister were to require GDF sewers to post a bond equivalent to the costs for cleaning up the rest of the mine, would you oppose that?
I think it would be unlikely that that would happen. However, whatever is legislated, then we would, if it came to pass, then we would have to comply.
So are you saying that you would not be opposed if required by the State of Victoria to post a bond which was equivalent to the amount of future clean-up costs for the mine?
What I said is we would need clarification on what the purpose of the bond was, and if it's clarified that the purpose of the bond and the requirement of the bond is to cover the full cost, and it was legislated, we would comply with the legislation.
And if this inquiry were to recommend that the amount of the bond be reviewed by an independent reviewer, would you oppose that recommendation?
I don't see the relevance of the bond and the value of the bond in relation to the current circumstances, but we would need to consider the position on it.
Can you say whether you would be opposed to it?
We would need to consider the position on it.
So you don't have a position as you can't say that you wouldn't oppose it.
I can't say we wouldn't oppose it.
Okay. I understand you mentioned you'd never seen this document before yesterday, but I'll just refer to it briefly. In the 2008 progress report attached to the 2009 rehabilitation plan, the document contains this statement: the mining licence requires the posting of a substantial bond to ensure that the mine closure and final rehabilitation never becomes a burden on the taxpayer. Now, do you agree that that statement is an appropriate one in relation to the rehabilitation bond?
I believe that $15 million is a substantial amount. I also believe that the interpretation that I gave you before in terms of the purpose of a bond, in terms of a retainer to be forfeited for not completing things to a satisfactory conclusion, is still valid.
I have nothing further. Thank you.
Mr Graham, I think you were in court or in the hearing room when Mr Incoll was giving evidence this morning.
I didn't actually, I didn't hear very much of it all. I heard some of it at the end, so I probably no more than 25% of it. But please go on.
All right.
We'll soon see.
That's right. Probably doesn't matter whether you heard this or not. This is what he said. He was asked a number of questions about whether or not the circumstances on the 9th of February this year were the worst case scenario in terms of fire risk for the mine. He said they weren't, and he explained that the weather could have been worse, fire conditions could have been worse, and that the wind change that changed the direction of the Hearns Oak fire to the north when it arrived, that is a southwesterly wind change, if it hadn't arrived, there was a risk that the front of that fire may have come straight into the mine.
Okay.
That was the evidence that he gave earlier.
Okay.
And you accept that those two scenarios would have potentially made the situation much worse?
Potentially. Look, I didn't hear what he said. Most certainly, I couldn't question whether things could get much worse. It didn't seem as if it could have got much worse to me being there on the day.
I can understand that perspective. My question's is what he said after that.
Okay.
What he said to the inquiry was that, drawing on all of his experience of fire-related matters, he said there are worse days to come. And he then said, why not prepare for them? Rhetorical question he raised.
Yes.
My question for you is GDF Sewers prepared if there are worse days to come?
I think that in terms of, when you say worst days, one of the things that I believe that we heard in evidence in the first day was not quite simultaneously because of the change in wind conditions, but we were actually under attack from two different areas in terms of embers, both the Hernsey Oak and the Driffield one. So I guess to some degree a sustained attack from one area to me seems less than what was actually happening on the day. However, irrespective of that, I think that the measures that we're looking to put into place here will certainly improve the position from where we were on the day. Whether in fact that would ensure there's absolutely no risk of being able to cope with something of a greater intensity or a higher threat. I guess I couldn't speculate on. All I can see is we're moving steps in what I would view to be in the right direction to try and mitigate similar events or worse events to that degree.
And they're the steps that are set out in the document you've provided to us, which is Exhibit 94.
Yeah, they are, but as I said before, we're not the fount of all knowledge by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes.
And we're obviously receptive to other things.
Mr. Graham, just on that point, I don't know whether you were in the hearing room when Professor Cliff spoke around international technologies that are being used, and I guess my point is around that broader thought leadership and whether other industry bodies, whether GDF participate in industry body thought leadership on whether it's the use of technologies or I guess how to embrace those future thoughts or new technologies or new ways of doing things.
Is the question related to is this to do with the capping, or is it to do with the monitoring?
Well, my question's more broad. I think your statement just now, and I didn't write it down, was you're not the font of all knowledge. So that prompted me to recall when Professor Cliff was speaking yesterday, in his evidence was talking about the use of technology, so different types of technologies. And I guess my question to you is, do you participate in that thought leadership area or other industry bodies about different things that you can do, not necessarily about capping specifically, but just the use of new technologies and emerging technologies?
Yeah, look, in terms of at the local level here, there's not too much goes on in that arena. Certainly other areas of GDF Sewers do more in the area, but I mean I guess within our organisation there are no other mines within GDF Sewers, and I'm not sure how many other industries there are power industries that actually own mines either, but most certainly we do a lot of collaboration with the other mines here, so any access to technology that would be appropriate, we could leverage off that for them.
One of the themes running through the evidence in the inquiry, Mr Graham, is apparent tension between an approach that's based on minimum compliance, that is compliance with an existing code or standard on the one hand, and what Professor Cliff talked about, which is continuous improvement or best practice. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Mr Polmy yesterday gave evidence about the circumstances in which the pipes in that area where the new pipes were installed were removed some 20 years ago or so in the early 90s, and he explained the background to that. I don't need to go over it. He was asked why weren't they replaced. I know this is well before you had any responsibility for the mine. He was asked why weren't they replaced, and if I can paraphrase him, the answer was, well, we didn't have to, under the code that was in operation from 1994 onwards. Now, it's the case, isn't it, that from 2005 onwards, at least up until this year, a similar approach has informed GDF Suez' attitude to pipe work, for example, that the attitude was we will comply in terms of pipe work and in terms of fire protection in the worked out parts of the mine with the requirements of the Fire Services Code of Practice. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. What I would say on that point, and when you did raise it yesterday with Mr Palmier in terms of compliance with the minimum requirements, I did actually feel at the time that in that instance, in terms of that area, you're absolutely correct. We complied with the minimum requirements. In terms of the mine overall, obviously we're not complying with the minimum requirements in all of the areas, so I would make the distinction about everything being to the minimum requirement, because I don't believe that to be the case.
I accept that distinction. I think that's
and certainly in terms of enhancements, be it enhancements to fire systems or be it enhancements to processes, we have actually had lots of enhancements to processes. Granted, a lot of the enhancements have actually been fueled by fires that have started internal to the mine, i.e. Fires associated with machinery, which is where our main focus has been. So in terms of the enhancements I'm talking about here are things, I think people were mentioned this morning about thermal imaging is an example. We have thousands of rollers on the conveyors. Fires in the past have started from combustion from a hot roller going onto the coal. We routinely use thermal imaging to check conditions of hot rollers. So whilst it's moving off the point a little bit, I'm trying to demonstrate to you that we do actually look for continuous improvement, and whilst that one is linked to response to an incident, which you might say that's not a great way of continuous improvement, you should be continuously improving in the absence of incidents. That's actually true as well, because in terms of how we perform in the last 3 years, not just in relation to fire, we actually, if you were to look at our records in terms of, I was asked about safety performance before, because there's a linkage here. In terms of the safety performance, the number of incidents have gone down, but if you were to look at our stats around the reporting of near misses, as an example, or hazards, the reporting of that has gone up tenfold. And that doesn't make me believe that we're having tenfold the amount of incidents. What it's telling me is we're very much focused on trying to learn from things before they become an incident. So I think that would be my response.
Right. Follow-up question is, if that's a correct characterisation of the approach that's been taken in relation to the worked out areas of the mine, I understand you make the distinction from that area with the operational areas. Yep. What will be the approach that will inform your future attitude to safety in relation to the worked out areas? Will it continue to be a minimum compliance approach, or do I understand you to be telling the inquiry that you're embracing a best practice continuous improvement approach throughout the mine, including the worked out areas?
I think it would be very naive of us to even suppose that we can continue in the manner that has happened thus far. You cannot ignore. A lot of the things around risk assessment is based around on evidences of what had happened. You have to take that into account. That has to influence the way you will progress going forward, and most certainly that's why, as part of the suggestions of things that we will enact there, we're not actually saying we will enact those things and we will do them on our own. What we will do is we will enact some things, we will consult with the relevant people that are stakeholders in that and have the knowledge and make sure that we get the correct outcome.
One of the commitments you have made in the red type section of your document, Exhibit 94, and this is on page 5 if you want to look at it, you've committed to conducting a review. This is the second main dot point on page 5 in the top box.
Yep.
Hazelwood will conduct a review to be undertaken by external consultants working with Hazelwood personnel of the current pipework and condition in the areas of the mine other than the eastern section of the Northern Batters.
Yes.
The reason you've excluded the eastern section of the Northern Batters is because that's the area where the new pipework went in February and March of this year.
And we are going to enhance, yes.
And you're going to enhance it, as you've explained. You use the word review, but you're essentially talking about a risk assessment, are you not? That's the concept that you're referring to there?
Yeah, during the explanation, I was actually asked by the board whether that would extend to a risk assessment, and I answered in the affirmative, yes. Yeah.
You refer there to external consultants. I know this is only a 3-day-old work in progress, but have you given any thought to the type of external consultants that you would be seeking to involve in that process?
No, to be honest, I haven't.
But
obviously it would be someone that was capable of performing it to a satisfactory outcome, which, in view of the fact that a risk assessment is associated with it, then they would obviously have to not just be pipework experts, they would have to be fire mitigation experts.
Yes. No doubt you're aware that there was a recommendation in a review in 2008 that such a risk assessment take place in relation to the worked out areas of the mine.
I wasn't until, bearing in mind, I wasn't until this morning, bearing in mind, whilst I've been at Hazelwood since 2005.
Yes.
I took up the position, I had no responsibility for the mine. I took up this asset manager position 9 days before the fire.
Yep, I understand that. Like Mr. Shanahan, I think you had an interesting first couple of weeks in the role.
That's the way of it.
I understand that's your personal position, but what the inquiry's grappling with is how that recommendation was not actioned. You understand.
Yes.
You understand what I'm getting at, don't you? Because a lot of what you're saying to us is, well, I'm going to drive this as the asset manager. I'm going to drive this going forward.
Yes.
And as Ms. Petering said, we welcome that commitment, but we've also got to look at the evidence about what's happened in the past. And presumably, whoever was in that position or the equivalent position as the CEO back in 2008, and more concerningly in 2012 when Mr. Kemsley did his audit, they didn't drive this. Now, maybe it was because they weren't informed, or we don't really know. But can you assist us to understand that? Would that sort of review have got to the top in the organisation in 2012?
Look, the answer is I don't know. In terms of the organisation now is heavily focused on compliance with requirements and things like audit action items and where we sit with them. GDF Suez as an organisation are very, very strict on compliance with what we've said will happen, and we have systems around things like what we call 1-star, 2-star or 3-star items. And if you have an item that is in the 3-star box, which means this has got extreme importance, believe me, that goes off-site and goes directly to Paris. So in terms of going forward, obligations on me as the asset manager will have a full follow-up, because irrespective of what has happened before, for whatever circumstances, I can assure you that in relation to this, it won't happen.
I'm going to ask you about some specific matters. Did GDF Sewers pay for the additional pipes that went in February and March of this year, or did the emergency services pay for them? They're the aqua pipes.
No, we did.
Can you tell us what the cost was?
$2.5 million.
And what was the, in addition to that, no doubt there were other costs associated with the fire and its impact on production. Have you quantified those?
I understand the costs that the fire has had an impact on Hazelwood, the business, with, yes.
Are you able to inform the inquiry what those figures are?
What I would say is tens of millions of dollars.
And I don't expect you know, but tell us if you do, what the costs to the emergency services were of the suppression of the fire. Is that a figure you're aware of?
No, I don't have any knowledge.
Has there been any contribution by GDF Sewers to those costs?
In terms of, I guess we pay actually a large sum in terms of fire service levy on a regular basis, of course, which is a substantial sum. In terms of any discussion about requirement for costs in relation to this event, there has been no discussion.
If I can just ask you some questions about your document, please, Exhibit 94. In the context both of the Phoenix modelling and of relations going forward with the CFA, I understood you to be saying that you wanted there to be more direct communication between the mine and the CFA rather than going through an intermediary such as the Central Gippsland Essential Industries Group. Have I understood you to be saying that?
Yes.
You know the evidence that was given in the inquiry about the provision of the Phoenix mapping to a representative of that group. That's obviously something you would need to talk to the CFA about, because the evidence that they've given the inquiry is that that group has operated for many years now as an entirely appropriate conduit for information provision both ways between major industries and the CFA. Do you take issue with that? Do you think this event indicates that it's problematic, the communication going through a third party?
Yeah, whilst I am aware of the Central Gippsland Essential Industries Group, I haven't been au fait with, let's say, the terms of reference of the group and the requirements on the group in terms of passage of information. My understanding was that whilst it is a body that passes routine information to members of the group and meets with other members of the group, I wasn't aware that they were the source of essential information that to me would seem that's potentially putting another layer in a system that might not need to be there. But of course, that's my view. We'll have to discuss it with the authority.
You accept that, looking at it from the point of view of the CFA, on a day like the 9th of February this year, there were a number of people they had to communicate with about the risks, number of essential industries in the vicinity of Morwell, as well as information to the community. And there presumably are limits in terms of resources on their ability to communicate individually with those various organisations. Would you accept that?
Potentially, and maybe I'm giving you the ideal outcome. And as we know, we can't always have the ideal outcome. What I want is a workable outcome.
I understand.
So, however it works, if it goes through 5 people before it gets to be, and it works, so be it. I'm very happy to have I'm only interested in the outcome.
Top of page 2 of your document, there's a reference to the acquisition of specialised mine fighting equipment, and I think there was a general surprise, perhaps, in the community that equipment had to be brought from interstate and so on. I won't go over the details of the evidence. My question, though, is this. Accepting the desirability of such equipment being permanently located and available in the valley, wouldn't it be appropriate for the mines and other essential industries that might benefit from that equipment being here to make a contribution to its cost? I see you have it identified as a CFA cost. Yep. Should it not at least be a shared cost between the state and those infrastructure entities?
Look, it would depend. It would depend on, I guess, deployment, likely usage. You're correct. People that are benefiting it depends what your view is as to what responsibility people have for providing an adequate service. Certainly, I'm not against the principle that says that if there is a service that is provided to you, why wouldn't there be some view that entities that benefit from things there? Then we should be able to talk about what, how that can happen. My starting point would be it would be good if it could happen. It's about, we've identified the what. Yes. We've yet to identify the how. The
how would be the subject of discussion.
Exactly.
All right. I want to ask you a couple of questions about volunteers. As you know, the inquiry's heard some evidence about from 2 volunteers who attended. I'm sure you know generally the evidence they gave. Both of them, Mr. Lawler and Mr. Steele, came from brigades quite some distance from Morwell. Due to the commitment of local brigades, and this is something you referred to earlier, they came from, in the case of Mr. Steele, Hayfield, and in the case of Mr. Lawler, Willow Grove. Now, they're both outside your 25-kilometre zone, and so the question is, given that it's entirely foreseeable that on another high fire day you're going to have people coming from far and wide potentially to assist, do you have any suggestions as to how those people can be better equipped to understand the matters that you've set out on page 2 of your document?
Yeah, and I guess that's always a dilemma, and I personally don't know how the CFA actually builds up their strike teams, as I understand we call them. Where normally they send a strike team that I believe consists of 5 appliances.
Yes.
So, in terms of people coming from outside, if the strike team was assembled and came together, it seems feasible that part of the strike team might well consist of members from areas that do fit within that. But accepting it may or may not, what I would say is, in terms of the familiarisation and even the discussion on the increased signage, that does not take away our intent to have escorts. We will still have in our procedures that when these appliances come to the site, the strike teams will be accompanied by Hazelwood personnel. Which and I accept that the evidence said they were having difficulty. I believe the difficulty they were having was more around access to the site rather than movement around the site, though.
Well, I think in fairness it was both.
Okay.
Mr. Steele told us that no maps were available to him when he arrived.
Okay. Yeah.
Which raises another question I want to ask you about, and that is, part of the explanation for that seemed to be that at that time power was down, particularly power to the control centre, and so there was a problem with printing. And it raises the question of backup power, at least for the control centre, which doesn't seem to be something you deal with here, but surely that's a pretty significant learning, isn't it, from this event? You can't have a control centre without power.
Yes, exactly. And the whole thing about, I guess, the incident control centre location, if you like. What we always have, and we do plan for, is that we have a set of circumstances that says that under a normal emergency or foreseeable emergencies, the incident control centre will be set up here. We also have provisions that say, in the event that this control centre is not available, where we will relocate to as the backup control centre.
Yes.
So that in itself, about the not working part, is I agree with what you're saying, but it's never an exclusive control centre. On the situation regarding maps.
Yes.
The arrangement that we actually have with the CFA, the Morwell group,
Yes.
is that because of their knowledge of the site and the interactions that we have with them, they actually have a swipe card.
Yes.
For getting in through the rear gate. Other people actually coming to the site for a response, when we're informed, when we call for them, and obviously we need to get the communications better on this, is what's supposed to happen is, when we know they're coming, we tell them where to come. So we direct them to where to come. In terms of availability of maps for emergencies, the gatehouse is at the main gate. There is no gatehouse at the rear gate. There is a slide entry. In line with most of the power plants I've worked at throughout the world, the procedure is the main gate houses in a metal container, big tube, essential information for people entering the site, which does include maps. So if indeed we tidy up the communication in terms of how and where to come, we wouldn't need necessarily, it depends how many you want, to be producing maps on a printer at that point in time. You know, we can have them available, and we do have available. Hand on heart, whether they're in the form that would be useful to a man coming in the mine, I acknowledge, but I'm just outlining that the process, what is normal and what we can ensure we do for the future.
We come back to backup power. There's just something slightly disturbing about a power station producing 25% of Victoria's power not having power to run a control centre. Maybe it's just me, Mr. Graham. What about a generator, a backup generator, such as we see in hospitals and other essential infrastructure that can be used to provide lights and basic electricity to the control centre? Is that something you've considered or will consider?
Yeah, look, in terms of the main infrastructure, we've discussed all of the backup supply options. Because that was a high level view of the major issues in terms of 66 versus 22 versus 11, versus redundancy. I think what we also did say in there is that, whilst that's the initial view of it, we would need to consult with in more detail with our electoral people to actually check, have we done everything that we can do to ensure the types of things you've said, certainly.
Coming back to the question of the CFA and volunteers in particular, the evidence the inquiry's heard, both directly from the volunteers and today indirectly from Mr. Incole, is there's an attitude, at least among some volunteers, that they don't want to attend fires at the mine. One doesn't normally hear CFA volunteers not wanting to attend fires. I've never heard it before, I've got to say, but we've heard it here. There's a real issue there, isn't there, about a degree of resentment on the part of some volunteers about having to regularly attend fires at the mine and do what is dirty and difficult work over long periods of time. Is that something you're aware of, that's an attitude that exists?
I don't believe that the regularly attend fires at the mine. Certainly there have been incidents, but I would hesitate to say regularly attend. My view on that would be, you're absolutely correct. Nobody wants to be fighting a fire in the mine. Why? Because it's difficult to put out. And
you're exposed to carbon monoxide while you're doing it. amongst other things.
Certainly, yes. Certainly, depending on the conditions, they can be very arduous conditions. And the majority of the experience from the CFA people and fire authorities, I guess, in general, is that they are absolutely fantastic at tackling huge flames in a short space of time. And they're very good at it. And I would like to just actually appreciate that during one time, during this mine fire incident, when the fire jumped out of the mine and was threatening the power plant, they did an absolutely fantastic job in preventing that from happening. So they're really good in that situation, and the majority of their training and response is in that. It's a bit like my experience in power plants, where you get an incident, it's a big incident, and it's over. Unfortunately, the nature of a fire in the mine is it absolutely drags everybody down, because you put it out and then you move on to the next part, and then you go back and you put it out again, and then you go back and you put it out again. So it would be absolutely draining for anybody, and I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to come back repeatedly. Sure.
But my question is, how is the mine, or how will the mine respond to that? That has implications, doesn't it, for the future in terms of needing to be more self-reliant on putting out future fires, if there are any?
Yeah, and look, the thing about the fires and how long it takes to put the fires out is all about getting onto it as soon as possible. So, and that's what a lot of this is aimed at. So the things around reducing the propensity of the fires, in terms of things like, we've said rehabilitation, we've said more pipe work, we've actually said the routine wetting down in the preparation in the non-operational areas that we didn't do, the increase in resourcing which would make us able to get to the various areas and put it out in a quicker manner. All of those things together puts us in a much better position to prevent a prolonged event.
I won't take you to the detail of this, but you've made a commitment in relation to vegetation on page 4 of the document, and that's understood.
Yes.
And that's not dependent on anyone else doing anything or recommendations being made here.
Yep.
Mr. Incoll was asked about that earlier today, and he said that not only should that be done, but it should form part of the policy. He was surprised that it wasn't part of the fire policy. You'd agree that it ought to be, wouldn't you?
Look, more certainly, if we recognise that we're going to clear it, then I would say by implication that once we've cleared it, we will keep it clear.
It raises a more fundamental problem, would you not agree, Mr. Graham? What you've got is a fire services policy which is essentially based almost entirely on a document that was created in 1984, the Latrobe Valley Fire Prevention Policy. So 30 years later, we've got a document. There's some changes.
94.
Well, 94 is the Generation Victoria one, but that in turn was based on the 1984 one.
Okay.
I don't want it to be a history lesson,
No.
But I think you know where I'm going with this. That document was prepared many years ago in a very different world in a whole lot of respects. Specifically, it related to 3 mines rather than just the Hazelwood one. Mm-hmm. It related to a time when each of the mines was owned by a public authority. Now, of course, they're in private hands. It's time, is it not, for Hazelwood to conduct a fundamental review of that document in light of everything you've learnt, particularly this year, and the commitments you're making to see whether it's suitable for the second decade of the 21st century, isn't it?
Yeah, look, sure, that's the way you capture continuous improvement. You know, you look at what it is you're going to do, and then you document, this is what we're going to do. And then you get somebody to come later and then audit you on, did you do what you said you were going to do? So I agree.
I'm glad you raised that point, because I think there'd be lots of people in the community, Mr. Graham, that would say these are great ideas, great promises, but how do we know that you'll deliver on them?
Exactly. Through the process that I've just mentioned there, I'm not going anywhere. I'm an Australian citizen now. I'm retired here, and I'm going to be in the community. I certainly don't want to be in this position again.
So
I don't want the community to be in this position again.
would you advocate independent regulation? Would that be through DSDBI and or Victorian Work Cover Authority, or how would you show the community that these things have been followed through on?
Look, I think that whilst I would give a commitment that we would look to do that, I think it falls with the board's remit to decide what mechanism is felt that needs to be put in place to do it, because this is actually not just about Hazelwood. This is about overall risk. So a commitment from me doesn't necessarily reduce potential impacts for communities in the wider sense.
One final matter, and it concerns community engagement. And obviously the inquiry is consulted very widely with the community, and we've had numerous community witnesses. And we've heard over and again what you've already referred to earlier today, and that is where was the mine operator and all this? Why weren't we hearing from them? And you know that. There's some damage to be repaired, is there not, in that relationship, Mr. Graham?
Yes.
And as I read page 6 of your document, under the heading Community Engagement, there's a reference to a review,
Yes.
meetings, and then there's third dot point, participation by Hazelwood in the review, and then a review of documents within Hazelwood, communications protocols, and that's all laudable. I'm not seeking to belittle that, but it's a bit ephemeral, isn't it? It's what practically is GDF Sewers doing to repair the damage in its relationship with the community of Morwell, and what are the practical plans?
Look, I think you would have heard Mr. Harkins say that the types of things that are happening at the moment, I fully appreciate that what we would call the social licence to operate has been compromised through this process. Certainly we have been trying to address some of the issues that impacted, as an example, the retail sector in Morwell, because we know that obviously because of the conditions here, not only did it impact on the people that were forced to live in the community, it impacted on people coming from outside the community, which therefore impacted on the businesses. So we have in some small way tried to revive the Morwell community through a process that you've heard about. So I'm not looking to reiterate what the process was. In terms of in a broader sense, we've always supported various aspects of the community in the past. We will continue to support the community in the future. Exactly what form it would take, I couldn't see at this point in time. Yes, there is an intent here, and as you say, yeah, but what is it we're exactly going to do? We need to do the work. But in some small way, we've tried to start with what we could in the time frame.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. The other questions that I have for Mr. Graham, members of the board have any further questions? I understand Ms. Doyle has no re-examination, so Mr. Graham could be excused, please. And Ms. Richards will take our last witness.
Last but by no means least, Mr. Lapsley.
Mr. Lapsley, I remind you that you have been sworn in under oath and that you're still subject to that oath.
Welcome back, Mr Lapsley.
Thank you.
There were a couple of things that you were asked to follow up on the last occasion that you were here, I believe. And one of those was to find and have produced to the inquiry the incident action plans that were in place at the Morwell fire station prior to the 9th of February. Now, that's been done, and those documents have been provided to the inquiry under cover of a letter dated the 12th of June from VGSO. I'd like to tender that because I'll take you to those incident action plans a little later on in your evidence. Now, the other document that I should tender at this stage is a diagram that Ms Petering's been asking for some weeks, identifying the operational communications structure for the Hazelwood coal mine fire at each of state, regional and incident level. So could I tender both of those documents, please, separately?
Separately or together?
Separately, please.
Separately, it will be 95 and 96.
My thanks.
So a good place to start, Mr Lapsley, might be by asking you to just briefly explain this diagram of the operational communication structure.
Yes, I can. Obviously, it's consistent with what we do in the state of what we call a line of control to have incident, region and state. So in the centre of that you'll see from the bottom the incident control, coming up to the regional controller, coming up to the state controller. Obviously for this fire we separated, we normally have a regional controller in place and was in place for Gippsland, and we separated that to have a regional controller for Gippsland to manage the fires, the wildfires that were running particularly in East Gippsland and Central Gippsland, and a second appointment was the regional controller for the mines, and we also called it the hazmat fire.
All right, so that was Mr Warrington?
It was initially. Yes.
I thought Mr Warrington held that position
throughout. He did. No, there was a roster system that saw a number of other people come into that position.
But you would not normally have two regional controllers,
No.
You would normally have one. But it is always the incident controller who manages the incident.
Absolutely, yes.
And the other levels exist to support the
and
incident controller to ensure resources are available as needed.
Yes.
And perhaps to relieve some of the immediate load of running the incident.
And engage particularly with the regional emergency management team, which is something I can explain in detail.
Perhaps you could do that.
Okay. So adjoined to that is something that in the last number of years we've made a special effort to make sure that we're not just focused on the incident. That is the incident controller and the responsibility for the management of the incident. We put in place what we call emergency management teams, and they operate at incident level, operate at the regional level and the state level. And that is the broader group of people. For example, I chair the state emergency management team, and in that room we have all functional responsibilities in there. And when I say functional, it's not by department, it's by function. So if it's about roads, it'll be Vic Roads. If it's about agriculture, it'll be the appropriate department head for agriculture and so on, including tourism, for Tourism Victoria and the like. So there is a regional emergency management team, and in this diagram it shows that the regional emergency management team had functional responsibilities for the plans that are in the diagram underneath, which included end-to-end, including community engagement, strategic planning, resources, performance environment, infrastructure, relief and recovery, and the health incident management side of it. So that's important that we actually operated that from the region, and the reason we operated that from the region was to ensure we got the appropriate engagement and supported the incident controller with those plans, and that the incident controller could get on with managing the incident.
Putting out the fire. We had some evidence last week about MJPIC.
Yes. And
there was reference made by Ms Tabane to its regional equivalent, which she called REMJPIC. Where does that sit in this structure?
Well, I'll go back. MJPIC is the Emergency Management Joint Public Information Committee, so it's about joint information. And it sits in this one in the community engagement and information functional subplan. It was put in there to ensure that appropriate people were looking at engagement and information, and being connected to the regional emergency management team. It means it's got EPA, health, human services, control, so regional control would be in there to lead it. In the example there, education were part of that to look at what was the communication and engagement strategy. Now, for example, if we go a little bit further, MJ Pixel was also talking to the incident level to ensure that the tactical communications was able to be communicated effectively, and they provided that support. So in this diagram here where you've got MJ Pick coming into the regional plan, and also a dotted line coming into the incident level as well.
All right. One more question about the structure. Where does the State Crisis and Resilience Council sit in relation to this structure?
I sit on the Resilience Council that sits above the State Emergency Management Team. So the State Emergency Management Team is the team that's got the daily responsibility, but daily looking at a strategy sense. And obviously the Resilience Council is about a whole of government approach. That's a broader issue, and it's actually moved from what is probably the emergency management issues to what is the crisis or disaster management issues that would be across whole of government and therefore whole of community.
All right. Next issue I want to take you to is to pick up from where you left off on the last occasion. You were giving evidence when you were last here about firefighter safety and the... get the terminology correct. The health management and decontamination plan that was adopted for the fire, which is an annexure 3 to your second statement.
Yes.
Now, just to recapitulate, this was adopted at the end of the first week of the fire.
Yes.
On the Friday. It was signed off by the regional controller and by yourself on the 14th.
Yes.
And it applied to those people fighting the fire in the mine.
Correct.
And if it provided for people in high-risk groups to be excluded from the firefight, so pregnant women, people with respiratory problems. It also provided for checking people's existing carbon monoxide levels when they reported for work, and those with a reading of 5% or over were retested in 15 minutes, and if they were still too high, they were sent away. And those people who got through that screening process were working within the parameters that are set out on page 17 of the document.
Yes.
And that identifies 4 different zones. A cold zone was up to 9 parts per million. Warm or unrestricted was between that and 30 parts per million. And as the firefight went on, up to that level, people were able to work on 2-hour rotation. Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct.
Then between 30 and 50, to work at that level, it was necessary to have a self-contained breathing apparatus. Quite a
yes,
short
which
duration.
I can give clarity to in a moment, yes.
And then over 50, nobody worked in those environments.
Yeah, now, in the evidence...
I haven't got to my question yet. And then we see cold zone community health limits. Government of Australia Department of Environment and Heritage recommend the ambient air CO level be kept below 9 parts per million and persons not exceed this level for more than 8 hours in 1 year. So that was the standard that the fire services adopted for its own firefighters on the 14th of February.
Correct.
Last week, Dr. Lester gave evidence about the carbon monoxide protocol that was adopted the following weekend, the 15th and 16th. And I need to take you to that. It is annexure 8 to Dr. Lester's statement. Now, it was Dr. Lester's evidence that this was drafted by the Department of Health staff who were here in the Latrobe Valley on the Sunday the 16th of February. And if you turn to the second page of that document, you'll see that there are levels for carbon monoxide exposure that are taken, we were told, from an acute exposure guide level that was developed by the United States Environment Protection Authority or agency. And we see there that the levels that are set for carbon monoxide starting at a 10-minute exposure at 420 parts per million. Over 30 minutes it's 150 parts per million. Over 1 hour it's 83 parts per million, and so on. And it was Dr. Lester's evidence, and this is borne out if you read down the document, that the 83 parts per million level was rounded down to 70 parts per million over 1 hour. And from 16th of February, this was the protocol that was applied to community exposure to carbon monoxide. Now, on the face of it, it would appear that this protocol tolerates much higher levels of exposure for the community than was being tolerated for firefighters who had already been through 2 screening processes. Can you explain that discrepancy?
Yes. First of all, go back to the health management decontamination plan. It's the one that's underpinned for the firefighters, so the occupation health and safety responsibilities for the firefighters. Yes. In my statement, if you go to the next tab of my statement, which is behind tab 4, and when we gave evidence on 2 Fridays ago, it was important that I read part of this email, and I can revisit it if you wish. But down underneath the dot points, so it's got 4 dot points there, we took advice from the scientific officer of MFB and the deputy chief officer from the South Australian Metropolitan Fire Service, who was here to provide this level of expertise, that firefighters would, in that scale that you put up before, don breathing apparatus at 50 parts per million.
Yes.
So it was at the upper limit of that scale, not the bottom. That was done and was, as it's mentioned in here, it seemed to be a conservative step, but a safe conservative step to do so. And it also looked for firefighters that at 75 parts per million, that they would then not only, if it progressed up, they would have already had breathing apparatus on, but if it got to 75, they'd then depart the fireground and seek other testing of that part of the fireground before they re-entered. Now, that's the OH&S responsibilities for the firefighters. You're right, when you actually then look at the community paper that's from the Department of Health, and it goes through what is the dosage and the exposure in that table that was up, about 27 parts per million over 8 hours, 33 parts per million over 4 hours. The second part of that that's critical is then taking that and putting it into the next part of that document, which is what does the incident controller do, or the public information officer, with the warnings.
But I'm actually not interested in that in the moment. I'm interested in getting an explanation, because you will appreciate there's been a fair bit of attention to this issue, about why it is that the community is not warned at levels which would see a firefighter off the fireground.
Yeah, now, that's why we need to step back a bit and understand that about the exposure. I should also be clear about the monitoring equipment. The monitoring for firefighters is done with one of these personal canaries, as Mr Harkins called them, which it's not state-of-the-art EPA grand monitoring equipment. It's just a personal monitor. And that's the same equipment that was doing the monitoring in and around the community of Morwell on the weekend of the 15th of 16th of February, wasn't it? Yes.
They were the same equipment.
Basically the same equipment.
Yes, they were taking the same readings.
They take the same readings.
Yes.
So from that you've got, on the 15th, if you take you to the 15th, we had protocols in place about firefighters. We didn't have the same, and that's why we sought health's advice on the 16th to say we need this level of information to advise incident controllers to issue warnings. Now, when you look at it, you've got the complexity of what is the difference between 30, 50 and 75 in a firefighter sense, and then dosage and exposure for community. Now, the other thing that it is also, and this can be debated in quite a technical way, A firefighter is at the coal front of where the carbon monoxide is potentially being produced. That is, that's being produced due to incomplete combustion, and therefore the early warning of that and the conservative view of picking that was really important. Whereas when we talk about the 27s, the 33s and the 83 parts per million, it's actually airborne and mixed fairly well with air is normally the case. That is, the community is a further distance away. You need to take other advice about technical advice about the difference of the 27, 33 and 83 than I can give you in a technical sense, and whether Health or one of the experts have already provided that. And one of the challenges we've just taken on as a result of committing to reissuing these plans and the SOP is to get the connection now exactly what you're asking. So we've engaged as late as yesterday with technical experts to say, what's it mean for a breathing apparatus and what is the message that goes to the community and are they consistent and what do we do? So in the review of these documents, that we've actually led ourselves to the same question as you've just asked.
Yes,
in what
it has
is the
to be consistent for the community. That's right. Firefighters, does it not? And it was not.
Yes.
And you're fair. Having trouble explaining why it was not, aren't you?
That's fair,
yes.
Because they've come from two different standards. We've got inconsistent standards of what is an occupational health and safety and what is therefore guiding from a health point of view the community.
And so it's no surprise that hazmat technicians who were tasked to take these readings using personal monitors that their colleagues were using in the mine and were getting higher readings that they knew would see their colleagues at least taking precautions,
yes.
were very disturbed that they were not able to warn the community.
Well, I'm not sure about not able to warn the community. There was warnings that went out. It was about the advice we were seeking on the 15th is what is the warning? And when you use shelter in place as a term and you don't understand the building stock and you've got other complexities. So I think it's more of what was the messaging. Yes. Now, the interesting thing on the 16th, it wasn't just about building a protocol. The 16th brought, as a result of the 15th, where there was a spike of a 54, I think was the highest spike for a very short period of time in the southern part of Morwell. The 16 brought the issue is not only what the protocol needs to be, what are the tools that the incident controller needs to have to be able to give proper advice, what's the clarity of networks of information, and although we had calibrated equipment, it's also the inconsistency of how you take those warnings. If you were EPA, I'm sure they would have told you, if they talked about their blanket network, they'll talk about a consistent height of detectors,
yes.
distance between, and it all gets calibrated. When you're using vehicle-based and mobile devices, it was not as comprehensive as it could have been on the 15th.
But they were the same devices that were available to the firefighters fighting the fire in the mine.
That's correct.
There was a warning that went out on the 15th, and we discussed that on the first occasion that you gave your evidence. In the face of much higher readings in the community on the 16th, there was no warning issued. You accept that was the case?
Yes.
And that was as a direct result of application of this protocol?
Yeah, this protocol. But yes, the health protocol.
The health protocol,
yeah,
not
which
the
was being built
protocol.
on the 16th.
Yes. So if we have one learning from this, it is that the two should be consistent and should be easily explicable to the community.
Yes, there's probably more learnings with that, but that's simply to put it, because it needs to be consistent across all activities from the first entry into the mine to the community with appropriate messaging. And I would suggest that even some of the methods we put in messaging now about shelter in place, we will challenge and ensure that the right messaging and the behaviour or the actions of the community will be more detailed.
All right. So we can put carbon monoxide protocols aside for now and move to a meeting that we understand took place here in Morwell on the 28th of February.
Yes.
Attended by you, Dr. Lester, Chief Commissioner of Police, Mr. Lay, John Merritt of the EPA, and the CEO of the Council. Did such a meeting take place?
Yes, it did.
Yes, and what was the purpose of the meeting?
It was actually, there was a number of meetings that day. It was actually to assist the Chief Health Officer to give advice to the community about what were the actions that she would actually issue later that day. And in regards to look at what did we have as information that would advise what parts, was it partial Morwell or total Morwell, or were there other parts of the valley that needed to have very detailed and direct messaging from the Chief Health Officer?
All right. Now, could Mr Lapsley, please be shown Exhibit 86. Sorry, we'll get that up on the screen soon, but while we're doing that, could you please have a look at those documents that are Exhibit 86? And that we are told by the Victorian Government Solicitor on instructions from Mr Merritt were the maps that were considered at that meeting on the 28th of February for the purpose of deciding which areas of Morwell should receive the highest priority in the warning.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Are they the maps that you considered?
They are. I've obviously, in a single dimension, we saw them in a slightly different way because it was a 3D model. So the modelling, it is the map, but you can actually look at it quite differently from the top down, and you see a different overlay of looking at Morwell from that point. Although it's the same product.
So it's the same product, but not the map that you looked at.
This was one of the maps. The one that advised me better was when you look straight down on top of it and you saw the red and the green areas and the blue areas looking down from a helicopter straight down on an aerial photograph.
Yes. So as we see, it's a three-dimensional view looking from the south-eastern side. No, I've got completely wrong. Looking from the northwestern side. And there is another map that is another three-dimensional view. It's your evidence, you said, that there was a third map that was a two-dimensional view looking from above. Yeah,
I'd seen, it wasn't the first time I'd seen this on the 28th of the month, I'd seen where you can actually look down on top of it, and it to me gives a clearer view of where the red and the green is as far as streets and locations, which was, I think, the defining factor about what later on was seen as Morwell South.
Yes, because it is quite difficult on that view to identify which areas. Could I ask that map please be made available to the inquiry, the two-dimensional view?
Yeah, so when you look down on it, you'll see the railway line, Commercial Road, and it shows quite clearly south of the railway line has significant red areas, and there's only a small number of red dots north of the railway line, and that was the defining piece that said that Morwell South was getting a different or smoke across all of Morwell, but certainly a more dense smoke in the southern part. I'll say the southern part, or what they call Morwell South at one point.
It's a very clear illustration, is it not, of the dispersion of fine particulate matter throughout Morwell?
Yeah, I believe so.
There's no reason why it couldn't have been shared with the community at the time that the advice was given, is there?
I think it's one of those that it would have helped. If I'm right, and you may want to check this, I think we took this to the community meeting at Kernot Hall, which was seen to be the protest meeting.
On the 18th.
On the 18th, I think it was one of the early ones we actually had in a line, but it might have been as descriptive with all the bubbles. It was actually showing that the south of the railway line was quite clearly more dense in the smoke and ash than other parts of Morwell.
Mr Lapsley, you did have some maps in your hand that I gather that you took with you. Are they the same as the ones in the folder? Yes, so that doesn't help us. So I do ask those who are representing you to find that two-dimensional map so that we can be clear about the basis on which that delineation was decided. And Mr Lapsley, that third map that we're going to be produced was also produced by the EPA?
Yes, it's the same map, it just gives us a different view looking down on top of it.
And is it your understanding that each of these blue, green or red dots is a reading from what we now know as the travel blanket? So in other words, that's its path, it sort of went all around there. Is that how you would describe that?
That's how I'd describe it. I will say I was surprised that it didn't come out in the CEO of EPA's evidence. I think it was touched on, but it didn't go into the detail, which I thought at the time that was quite surprising because it's quite a fundamental tool that assisted some decision.
And nor did it come out in the Chief Health Officer's evidence. Moving to a third area.
So just help me for a second. Where did that come from then?
Well, that was provided subsequently by Mr Merritt through Victorian Government Solicitor.
Okay. Right.
All right, moving to a third area, and now we are moving into the area of prevention and mitigation, which is why I did ask you to come back on the final day of the hearings. We've had a good deal of discussion in this room over the last 4 days about risk assessments, and part of any risk assessment is understanding the cost of not putting controls in place. Recent experience is going to give some guide to that. We had evidence in the first week of the hearing about the massive firefight that took place during February and March, and it did appear that no expense was being spared to put the fire out. How much did that exercise cost?
I can give you my figures. The latest figure that I've got from Metropolitan Fire Brigade, so MFB and Country Fire Authority, is $32.5 million is the cost at this point. That's the cost of the resources within Victoria, the resources that we use from air services, Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia, Fire Rescue New South Wales. I think I've got all of them. It includes the HR component, so the career, obviously wage or salary components.
Is there a value put on the time of volunteer firefighters?
No, we haven't. That's not in there. That is not in there, and we're very careful how we put a badge to the price of volunteer labour. That has always been a huge issue. So it's not. It's actually costs. The 32.5 is the costs that have been incurred and been billed, and that will be brought together over the next number of weeks as a consolidated figure.
And who bears that cost?
Well, it's bared by the two authorities, so both MFB and CFA. That's where it is at the moment. CFA have taken on the responsibility to pay the bills for the interstate services. Obviously, that will be considered by the financial parts of CFA, and jointly CFA and MFB will it's not within their budget, so it'll be an issue for government. And separate to that, under the CFA regulations, so CFA Regulation 97, there is the potential to recover costs from the owner-operator of the mine. So it's a provision within the CFA regulations, so Regulation 97 of 2004, and that will be considered or is being considered. And it's very unlikely that that provision provides total cost recovery, and it would obviously be a discussion between sewers and led by CFA.
All right, so I hadn't got to the regulations, I got to Section 87 of the CFA Act that provides, and I defer to your greater knowledge of the area, but Section 87 provides only for recovery of the costs of providing firefighter services from a property owner who's uninsured.
That'll be the debate. If you go a little bit further, it goes into what is insured, what's the fire service levy contribution, so it comes into a negotiated discussion and the application of what is the Act and the regulation.
All right. So
and that will be obviously a point that CFA will lead at some point in time with sewers.
Now that reference in Section 87 to uninsured is a bit out of date now, isn't it?
Yes.
The fire services levy is no longer placed on property insurance. It's collected through rates.
Yes.
And that's a bit of tidying up that should be done, is it not?
That's part of the process of moving in the next piece of legislation or next pieces of legislation is to tidy up from what was insurance levy based to what is property based.
All right. So an extraordinary cost to put out a fire, and there's going to be a very difficult discussion, I imagine, between the CFA and the mine operator about how those costs are shared.
It could be difficult. You'd suggest it probably would be difficult. However, the CFA position would certainly be to look at the Act and the regulations, and like I said, it's not written for total cost recovery. It talks about it's got a formula within the regulations which I won't go to.
Now, you were in the room, I think, when Mr Graham gave his evidence about costs incurred by the mine operator, and he said that the cost of laying the new pipes at the eastern end of the northern batters was $2.5 million, and that cost had been borne by GDF Sewers. Do you agree with that evidence?
That's the first I've heard of those costs, but I do know that obviously Sewers that wouldn't be the only cost they put in. There was infrastructure to be put in a number of places, and certainly mines resources, both physical and infrastructure that was put in place in significant areas of the mine.
All Right, so there's not been any question of GDF Sewers looking to the state for reimbursement for installing that work?
I'm not aware of that. However, there would be some costs that the incident controller would have signed off in regards to some of the infrastructure. And that's why it'll be a discussion with Sewers at some point in time about what is the total cost, what is the package, what is the application of regulation. And no doubt Sewers will have a position about their fire service levy contribution.
And that's a discussion that's yet to be had? That's
a discussion that the CEO of MFB will lead.
The next area I'd like
CFA, I should say. The CEO of CFA will lead.
The next area I'd like to ask you about is an aspect of fire prevention planning, which is pre-incident planning between the CFA and the mine operator. And you've been good enough to provide to us via VGSO 2 documents, as I understand it. One is a PDF copy of the pre-incident plan, which is a 2-page document. If we could have a look at that, this is part of Exhibit 95. And it's the first 2 pages of the annexure. So this is a document that was just tendered. So I want to be sure that I've understood. All right, so that's the first page, protected premises information, Hazelwood Power Station, and then over the page, protected premises information, Morwell Open Cut. Is that the document that's referred to as the pre-incident plan for the 9th of February?
That is. And when you say for the 9th, it's a standing pre-incident plan that sits there 365 days of the year.
All right, so it was in place on the 9th of February. It's pretty basic, isn't it, Mr. Lapsley?
It's basic for a reason. Normally, if you saw this for the Latrobe Valley Hospital or a school facility, it'd be more comprehensive. The reason it's not is there's the mines being declared essential services, all mines having that overlay, which is covered off with the Terrorism Act. There's very sensitivities around the level of information that sits outside the mine. This is the best way to explain this, and we could discuss in detail about how much more it needs to be.
I think before we do that, we might go to the next document as well and see what is carried on the Morwell Brigade fire trucks, because that will give some additional context to what you're about to say. The next document, and it's page 22 goes through a number of pages of 100, so it's part of a bundle of information that's carried on the Morwell Brigade appliances. Is that correct?
Correct.
And there's a spreadsheet. Again, it seems to be for the power station and the mine together. Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct.
And there are some maps or satellite photographs with various points marked. Now, do we have those? I'll give you the document number if that assists. No, I can't give you the document number. It apparently has not yet been uploaded to Ringtail. So we'll have to do it without the benefit of the image, but you have the document there in front of you, I think.
I do.
In relation to the mine, there are 2 satellite photographs, and all that is labelled on them is Mine Control Centre, RTL Car Park Assembly Point, Fire Services Ponds and Pumping Station, there we are, and Training Centre Assembly Point. And then there is a more detailed or a blown up photograph of the Mine Control Centre and various points on that. So again, it's pretty basic, isn't it?
Yes. Now,
and then the next 2 are of the power station, so we don't really need to look at those.
Yep. So from that, and this could be an area of improvement. The description that's been given to me about why it's in this frame is, first of all, is the security overlay. The one that I've had given to me here now is only got 2 maps. There's actually 4 maps, which I think are all there. So there's the 4. Take that.
We don't actually need to look at the maps of the power station.
No, but I think
that's a problem that we're not grappling with at the moment.
No. I think though what I see here, and this is something we will take away about what pre-incident plans lead to and how they interface. The description of this for an officer riding on the Morwell fire trucks is that this is information that is safe to talk about and doesn't breach the security issues of the site, and that's been a key issue. But it also sets what is for the career officers or the responding officers off appliances, the base level for them to assemble their plan once they get there. So the pre-incident plan is a pre-incident to get you onto site. Then you need to do situational awareness of, is it the fire in the bunker, the pit, the conveyor belt, whatever. And this is the constructed by the officers at Morwell, and their explanation would be very clear that this is the fundamentals to be able to build the plan. That is, get to the gate, get in the place, get the pilot, because it's critical to have the pilot, and then be able to say...
a guide around the mine.
A mine guide, so they're connected to the internal communications of the mine, and these then are the elements to say, we're going to assemble at the pond, or we're going to assemble at the given assembly point, or whatever. So those second sets that shows... that I haven't got here, but it's got all the arrows pointing into the power station, tells you about the fundamentals of the power station. It also tells you that there's a great emphasis placed on the power station.
Yes.
And a structural risk and the need to not see power turned off or restricted in its production. And I think it tells you in itself that maybe the mine, the deep part of the mine, hasn't necessarily got the same level, but they build the plan, or they build their action plan as they see where the fire, the smoke and the challenges that it does offer.
Well, not to beat around the bush, the sparseness of the information provided on these maps is because of security concerns, because there is a perception that the power station is a potential terrorist target.
That's
correct.
That's one of the reasons.
Now,
yes.
We also know that, and we have known for many, many years, that there is a very real risk of fire in the open cut mine. You're not seriously suggesting that identifying water points on a photograph or a map of the mine is going to compromise the security of the power station?
It's deficient in that part of the plan, would be a fair observation.
And a further deficiency, and I think you referred to this last time, is that this is information that's quite closely held. There's only a limited number of people who have it and have access to it when an emergency arises.
True, except the maps are in fire trucks. They're not secure in fire trucks, so someone could disappear or could be used by other people from within the fire truck.
And the worst that would happen if we had the water points on the mine shown is that people would know where to fill up a fire truck should they need to be in the mine for that purpose.
Or whatever with water. So you did right. So that's a deficiency of this plan.
Yes. And another deficiency is that it doesn't have any after-hours phone numbers for the people who might need to be contacted in the event of an emergency.
And I think you'll find that's all the numbers and names are out for security reasons, and then it goes to the... it's written in the procedure about, it's probably written in here, they go to Diamond Protection or whoever it is as the single point of getting access to all of the appropriate people.
So they go to the front gate, which is what they do in any event, isn't
That's right. That's the first responding place.
Yes. Now, as things transpired on the 9th of February, and I think you were in the room when Mr Incoll was giving his evidence this morning, on a horrible day like the 9th of February, quite often it can happen that the Morwell Brigade is detained elsewhere, and all of that knowledge is with them.
That's right.
And volunteers coming from Willow Grove or Hayfield don't know it.
Yep.
There has to be a better way.
I think there's 2 points here, and without, you can go into a lot of detail about what's appropriate planning. The fact there is assembly point that straight away there'll always be some local officer left in Morwell. Not everything goes away. It's about getting the trucks to the assembly point where they can be briefed and managed into the site appropriately. That is there about the assembly points. What isn't there though, and I think you raised it before in a number of, to what I've heard, is how do you get this when you're from the Sale Fire Brigade or the Geelong Fire Brigade and you've been responded in? What are you given as you go in? And there's probably two parts of that. One is if there's an incident controller well established, there would be an incident action plan that then would be communicated. But in those first number of hours for the first responding brigades in there needs to be access to this basic information coming in.
And the answer is that it should be pre-prepared and it should be held
That's
at
right.
the mine, at the gate.
At the gate. And I think previous evidence might have said there is something at the gate, but is it comprehensive enough? Does people know it's there? Is it used in an effective way? The answer is I don't know, but I'd suggest it's not there in that format.
Right. Now, can we go back to your first statement?
Sorry, Mr. Chisholm, who would be responsible for preparing that, pre-preparing that?
Well, it's the officer in charge of the Morwell Fire Brigade, so it's from a CFA point of view. And that's for obviously Hazelwood, if it was for Loyanga to be the Traralgon Fire Brigade. So it's a responsibility back at the fire station level for these to be produced and kept current.
Right, Mr. Lapsley, we asked you in your first statement to identify any plans that were in place for mitigating the fire risk at the Hazelwood mine, and you provided us with, or referred to two documents, one of which I'm going to take you to, which is the Gippsland Regional Strategic Fire Management Plan that was referred to in paragraph 210 of your statement, I think. Now, this is the product of integrated fire management planning, have I understood that correctly?
That's correct.
And this is the strategic plan for the Gippsland region. And if we can turn to page 27 of the document, there's a regional register of assets at risk, and this has been prepared using the Victorian Fire Risk Register, has it not?
Yes, the risk register underpins it.
And not surprisingly, we see that the top two assets that are identified as at risk are firstly the power stations and secondly the coal mines. Now I do apologise, it's very difficult to read. So we've looked at this document a number of times this week, but you would agree that the risk rating that's given there's a likelihood of the scenario, which is fire in the mines occurring, is likely. The consequence is catastrophic and hence the risk is rated as extreme. And then we get to the column that identifies existing treatments. Now, we've asked a number of witnesses about this in the course of this week. The first one that's mentioned is legislative controls, including MHF, which we assume stands for Major Hazard Facility. And the evidence of Mr Neist is that the mine is not a major hazard facility.
That's correct.
And those provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act do not apply to it.
It's not a major hazard facility. I'd have to take advice of the provisions of the 2007 OH&S regulations.
It's a prescribed mine.
Yeah, so I would have thought that those would still have relevance, even though it's not a major hazard facility. That's actually, when I read that, and I didn't have it with me, but I read that this morning, a major hazard facility is incorrect for that site.
Yes, it's a prescribed mine, which has its own occupational health and safety controls, but it would be useful to at least get that right, would it not? Then emergency management plans, and we've had evidence about the mine's emergency response plan and how it was implemented on the day. So there is a plan. CFA pre-incident plans, we've just been looking at what there is and we've agreed that there's considerable room for improvement. On-site firefighting resources, we've covered off on that. And then DPI regulatory planning. The evidence of Ms White from what is now known as DSDBI is that they play no role in mitigating fire risk at the mine, which leaves the existing treatments looking pretty thin, does it not?
I think there's more of a fundamental problem here. It's about how that plan's been developed, and then the membership of the committee, the regional committee, is not connected into the industry nor the regulators. So someone's done a fantastic job to have the crystal ball to get a risk assessment done, but the description is incorrect with the fact that it's got major hazard facility being referenced, and obviously the treatments are a list of treatments that are obvious treatments but not engaged treatments to see what are the appropriate treatments and what are achievable treatments.
Well, and the ones that really do exist, the emergency management plans, the CFA pre-incident plans and on-site firefighting resources are mitigative controls after the event rather than preventive controls, are they not?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And obviously they're dealing with risk and hazard, they're not dealing with consequence, which is where we would like to go in the future, which we may get the opportunity to talk today about, that it's not just dealing with coal and the potential of fire, it's actually dealing with coal, the potential of fire and what it actually produces and where it goes.
Well, can we talk now more generally about integrated fire management planning? It's an idea that's been around, I think, since 2003.
That's correct.
Brainchild of Bruce Esplin. And it's a great idea, but it's a bit of an orphan, is it not? It doesn't have a home.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair to say, in the sense that it's living on old legislation. It lives under.
It doesn't live on any legislation at all, does it?
Well, it lives on what is the CFA Act of Regional Fire Prevention Plans and Municipal Fire Prevention Plans. So in section 52 to probably about 56 of the CFA Act, it describes what is regional and municipal fire prevention plans. And in the right method of moving forward, and what was identified in the early 2000s is fire prevention was only one part of it. What's fire management in a broader sense? That's been a worthwhile exercise, but 10 years on, there's still not legislation that shows that it's about fire management and not fire prevention.
And I think you may be aware of the evidence of Lance King, who's the Coordinator of Emergency Management here, who described the development of the local municipal fire management plan and identified some very real issues with both engagement and resourcing of the planning process, and more concerningly, authority to implement the outcome of the planning process.
You're correct. That lives as a frustration, particularly at municipal level. Since 2009, there's been significant resources put in the back of this to ensure that every municipality has a municipal fire management plan, known as a fire management plan, but underpinned by the legislation, which is fire prevention. And likewise, each of the 8 regions, the whole of government regions, have a strategic plan similar to what you see here. That's been achieved for the first time in the last 14 months. That meant we had to put resources in to lift the skills to be able to bring what is broader than just bushfire, so bring it to a fire, not all hazards, to a fire broadness, that includes structure and others. That's why you'll see here attempts are being made, but the rigour is not behind it to deliver in a way that's appropriate.
So
that's the frustration.
What's the answer?
Well, we need to modernise legislation for a start. We need to acknowledge.
Are we going to see a set of provisions in that they might have been in the Fire Services Commissioner Act, but that's
no, didn't get up there.
No.
The next part, though,
will we see them in the Emergency Management Act 2013?
In 2013, you won't. There's 4 parts of legislation for the Emergency Management Act to move it forward. The first part has been in place, which is the governance arrangements, which is the Emergency Management Victoria, Emergency Management Commissioner. The second part is planning. That's the one that's on the table at the moment. The third part is the control mechanisms, which is listed for 2015. And the final bit is what I'll call the miscellaneous parts of legislation, but it brings the 1986 Emergency Management Act to basically be replaced by a comprehensive Emergency Management Act of what will be then 2015. So it's a 4-step process to get governance in. You think about it, it's frustrating, but we almost need the new 1st of July to come, so then we've got the governance to be able to lead this to be in a way that's got the planning and control mechanisms appropriate. And obviously the opportunity here is that the learnings out of this event will be key to put into the planning and control of what is new legislation. That's the opportunity.
Integrated Fire Management Plan is more than 10 years old now. Until the middle of last year, it was supported by a team that was auspiced by the CFA. And Mr King's evidence was that team's now been disbanded or disfunded.
The team's still there. The team.
Where are they now?
They're about to go to Emergency Management Victoria, and they've just been reappointed in new jobs. So that the same number of people are there, but we've got to take it from fire to be emergency. So what has been fire dominated is now the next iteration is to take it to an emergency footprint. So the 11 funded positions that were in integrated fire management planning have now been restructured to become part of what will be emergency management planning, to be the broader piece and take on what is the new legislation about consequence.
I think you heard Mr Incoll this morning make the observation that a plan is all very well, but unless it actually translates into action, it's only a plan. What legislative bite will be given to integrated fire management planning or emergency management planning to actually implement the treatments that are identified as appropriate?
Since, and I'll say 2010, so and I think everyone appreciates the events of 2009 really took another 12 months before we saw what the Royal Commission was able to put on the table and the action that occurred. So since 2010, like I said, we've achieved each municipality with a plan, each region with a plan. In March 2014, only weeks ago, we approved at the State Fire Management Planning Committee the evaluation, monitoring and reporting. It's a policy direction, not a legislative direction of how we hold accountability to agencies to deliver against the plan. So it's a policy document, not a legislative document. And that's the start of saying, Vic Road, you've got this responsibility, or SB AusNet, or whoever these partners are, to actually be able to be evaluated, monitored and reported against achievement. And quite often...
But that's really no more than a name and shame process, is it? There's no ability to compel performance of anything.
No, we haven't got legislation. So we're using a policy, goodwill, compelling document and reporting as a result of that up through the Resilience Council to secretaries to say we haven't achieved what would be statutory authority and government department buy-in and achievement and implementation.
And that's one thing in the public sector, but to be able to implement this plan you will need cooperation and action from a whole range of private sector agencies. For example, the operator of the Hazelwood mine.
So,
which brings me to another legislative question that was highlighted in Mr Incoll's evidence this morning. Section 43 of the CFA Act requires requires a certain standard of fire management on publicly owned land. And one of the side effects of privatisation of the mines is that no longer applied to the mines. Has any consideration been given to extending the reach of that section?
I think they've defaulted back, and I may have it wrong here, but I think Section 41 is where they default back to.
Well, that relies on the
municipality to issue the direction.
Yes. Is that realistic?
Well, no, it's not. Well, I don't know whether it's realistic, but it's not common practice for municipalities to go and do, particularly what are macro issues, and takes quite a lot of technical advice to do so.
Their focus is on fine fuel control, isn't it?
Yeah, fine fuel and what is seen to be community amenity fine fuel too, I'd add, that sometimes these big parcels of what is seen to be either private, public or a joint, and where we get the interface is why the integrated planning was actually put on the table to get these interdependencies and these interfaces about where land or hazard is to be dealt with better. And that is an ongoing issue and relies on goodwill and not legislation as we currently sit here.
So consideration could be given to extending the reach of Section 43 to what is identified as essential state infrastructure, could it not?
Correct.
Again, not without discussion with those owners, but that's probably a more realistic way than relying on municipal fire prevention officers to serve fire prevention notices on multinational corporations who run essential state infrastructure. And
you would also suggest and challenge whether it should be in the CFA Act, because the CFA Act's dealing with country area Victoria, and we have the issue where those municipalities that, for example, could be partly in the Metropolitan Fire District and country area, and or those that are solely in the Metropolitan Fire District. So we would say, in an ideal world, that it's part of the new emergency management legislation in regards to planning.
All right. Was there any more that you wanted to say about the future for integrated fire management planning and how it can live up to its undoubted promise?
One, it's a necessity. You can't. It's quite clear in the landscape. You need to take a landscape view, not a tenure, not a land tenure view, and that's been one of the traditional problems of our old legislation. The discussion between public and private land has always been inherent in our legislation, And that's why integrated planning is important, but we've got to make sure it's landscape focused. And when I say landscape, it deals with the total landscape and doesn't come up to find we run into other pieces of legislation about declared essential services, and therefore it stops. That's being dealt with something else over there. So we do need to make sure that we get the landscape, the total landscape in understanding planning. And I think the other thing that hasn't, I don't believe it's been discussed, certainly hasn't been over my desk, is how do we interface with land use planning and building control?
Yes, well, it's pretty much defeated us, that question. The position that's put by Mr Incoll this morning was, well, you have to accept the legacy of poor land use planning decisions in the past, recognise the right of people to use their land as they have used it and deal with the risk that arises. But in terms of minimising, for example, new plantations going up, including on land owned by the owner of the Yallourn mine, is there anything concrete under discussion at the moment?
No.
No.
But this is the new opportunity about where we take the Emergency Management Act. We've got the will to take it there. Now we need the discussion to make sure it's framed appropriately and it has the right interfaces. And the other thing that I could be challenged quite significantly by this, but if I have to lead emergency management's got to be put in the discussion as the business of the business, not an afterthought. I think that for many years we've left this emergency management, this fire management thing over here, dealt with the broad land use planning, building control, and then added to it. And it needs to be front and centre to understand what we're doing and where we're allowing development, whatever the development is, to occur, of what is the impacts and therefore what's the consequence. And that's why the emergency management legislation we've currently got, the first iteration of it that talks about consequence management, is a very important fundamental step of reform. It's significant reform.
I think you were here this morning when Mr Incoll gave his evidence and outlined a number of measures that he proposed, having taken the landscape view of the fire risk in the open cut mine and in particular the worked out areas of the mine. We can put up on the screen.
I didn't hear all of.
You didn't hear all of his evidence. Have you been able to review his report before?
I have read it. Yes, yeah, it's quite comprehensive in detail.
Yes. Well,
I just inquire whether there was anything of the recommendations, for example, that you reacted to as inappropriate?
I don't know whether it's inappropriate, Your Honour, but I think some of the concepts would need that practical lens of how you would actually achieve it. And when I say that, it's easy for all of us to dream the concepts. It's another thing to have the pragmatic approach of how we get collaboration, commitment and the accountability. And I use the word about accountability. Whose accountability is what? I have an opinion that you may not need to see major reform in the regulatory area. You may have a different opinion from the evidence you've heard, but there's gaps in alignment and gaps in a collaboration and how to get an outcome that's appropriate. And obviously, in a true risk hazard setting, we're not dealing with the consequence. So how do you actually build that other element in that says, well, yeah, we can deal with a fire, but really it's not the fire we're dealing with, it's actually the smoke or the ash, and that's the classic of this. You know, we're dealing with a fire, but the biggest issue, as we all know, was actually the pollutant that was coming from it, and the management of and the understanding of that pollutant and the communication of it. So, without trying to complicate it, I've got no reason to not accept other people's evidence, but I think it's the pragmatics of how you actually make it work in a way that is not over bureaucratic. And in an area where you've got corporatised and privatised businesses, of how do you get true engagement without becoming to the absolute prescription of the old regulation days. You know, I don't think we need to go back to prescription, but we need some solid guides and support in an accountability model.
Well, I've got the microphone. I asked the question about Mr Incoll's recommendations. You've also made suggestions, if you like, as to recommendations in the last 3 or 4 pages of your first statement. is there anything there that you feel obviously needs modification, or are they really more possible additions or modifications?
I'd have to go back to my first one. If you go back to...
The chair is stealing my thunder because that was the last question I was going to ask you, and we might go to it now.
Yeah, so...
if you've said what you wanted to say about Mr Incoll's...
Yeah, well, look, I've got no reason to... But again, some of its concepts, and I didn't hear the full understanding or description of some things that put there. If I had to sum up what I think we've seen, is we've got to come back with the new guideline for, to have a 1994 Generation Victoria guideline that I see in evidence from DSBI to be the principal document. And then all I can see from that, and I might be proved wrong by the evidence, but is iterations by mines. So Hazelwood have their own version, there's a number of iterations, and your Lawns probably got theirs own. Where's the principal document that sets the direction about fire service policy, if that's the right term, because it might actually need a little bit broader than what that actually means of the 1994 document. That's a piece of work we have had a look at, and I think the new good practice guide is an absolutely critical piece of work, and the question I've got is who owns it? Who should own that and ensure that it's current and it's audited and been able to be implemented?
So what is the good practice guide?
I think it's the replacement of the 1994 fire service policy.
Which is based on a 1984 document.
That's right. Now,
at a time when there were no worked out matters.
I haven't found the typewriter it's been written on, but I haven't found it on a computer yet, but it's certainly got a bit of age in it. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but to have a 1994 document as the document we hold up in this hearing, I find that amazing.
Yes.
But I'll just leave it. We need to take that as a priority to put it as the document that we can actually manage the industry and work with the industry in a collaborative way to get it somewhere. That's got to be one.
And so you're saying you'd like to see that happen across the three mines?
Oh, it's broader than that. You've got a mine at Anglesey. It's got to be about the Victoria... It's got to be broader than that. To make sure that the mines in the valley and the broader mine, being the Anglesey mine, is there and can operate successfully. Then I think it goes to the integrated planning that's landscape focused.
Just before we do that, Ms Lapsley, does that good practice guide exist, does it? Did you say it?
No, it's the guide that would have to be produced to replace the 1994 document.
Thanks.
So my understanding is, on the evidence that I saw Kylie White put forward, she referenced the 1994 Generation Victoria document as the document.
And the evidence is that it has been reviewed from time to time, but it's essentially the same document now as it was in 1994, and that was essentially the same document as in 1984.
Is the implementation model appropriate to get the implementation of our recommendations, or have we really gone beyond that now? Do you have something else as being more appropriate?
So that's monitoring the implementation of what you will recommend.
That's right, but that ties in to some extent with what you're saying about the desirability of the matters that you recommend being monitored, which ties in with Mr Incoll saying that it's not just enough to have something laid out as a general plan, but seeing that something is done about it.
The model of having an implementation monitor, which is Neil Comrie for the bushfire and also Neil in the flood, does work. We work very closely in a fire sense. It works. What we have to do, though, is make sure that that model then goes into a sustainable model. And by legislation, the new Inspector General of Emergency Management would have that responsibility. So I suppose the question I'd put back is, do we need a Neil Comrie type implementation monitor, or is the new IGEM that's legislated able to do what Neil has done? And it might be a bit of both that gives us emphasis in the first 12, 18 months and then gets handed across in a sustainable system of what the Inspector General of Emergency Management legislated to do could do. That's a discussion that you could have, but the principle of having someone accountable to be the oversight of implementation of major changes or reform or improvement, whatever it is important. It is important. The other one, if I may, is where you've started with integrated planning. Integrated planning is absolutely critical. Integrated planning that's landscape focused, that deals with land use planning, building control, all of those, cannot be underestimated. and it needs to have strategy, and it needs to reach down. And I think I did hear Mr. Incole talk about it. It's fantastic to talk about the state level, but you've also got to have the action at the bottom. And that means that we've got to provide it the rigour, the legislative underpinning and the mechanisms to engage properly. Now, when I say that, there is a new model of engagement. It's not an old bureaucratic model. It has to be true engagement where it brings in relationships but accountabilities. There's no longer can we rely that we've got it where it's a bureaucratic model and doesn't understand the corporate or the private businesses that operate in the state. They are absolutely critical to the way in which we do it. Forgetting this incident, some of the things we deal with in emergency management, telecommunications, the telcos are absolutely critical to the business we do. They cannot be held outside. They have to be brought in and held and worked with to have the accountabilities. Now, some of them are government departments or behave like government departments, other of them are multinationals. So the business side of the way in which we deal with emergencies is critical. So I say the three partners is, the agencies have responsibilities and the departments, the community, but the third one's got to be the business sector. And the business sector here is the big part. That's the sewers of the world that are the multinationals that actually have expertise, are well respected, and they are a critical part of any community.
And the benefits of good working relationships and cooperation and collaboration are not to be underestimated, but you do encounter varying degrees of willingness to engage in that process, and it's useful to have that underpinned by a strong legislative basis.
Yes, regulation, and what I say is an accountability, and people are clear what they're accountable for.
And what will happen if they don't meet.
Yes. Yep, so that's got to be there. And then, I suppose the other big one for me, which people probably say is number one in the whole thing, is how we deal with communities. People talk about it's communications, it's about information. It's not that. It's actually our whole approach to deal with communities, and communications and information is a subset of how we do that. Our approach to it, the engagement before, the during, the after, and one of the critical things that comes out, I think, of this whole discussion is when we walk out of here today or next week, that there's still a Morwell community out here that is deeply concerned about a whole heap of things that they don't understand necessarily, or they're finding they've got a whole heap of other questions. So, although the emergency's finished, the inquiry might be finishing soon and you'll hand a report down, the commitment to work with the community, which I think is the new model. If we show commitment to Morwell and the Latrobe Valley after this event and show trusted networks and map it properly and understand and respect groups of people that are well led and are leaders in their own community, that in itself might be an input to how we actually build a new model. We might learn some things in August, September, October this year out of Morwell that actually helps us build the new model about what I call is the trusted network model. That is, we know who they are, we know the Rotary, the Lions, the Cubs, the Scouts. All of those are as important, the schools, the principals, who's the leaders in communities, who's the respected leaders, and who are the other leaders that sometimes are the formal leaders and other times the informal leaders. That is easy for me to say, not easy to do, but it's got to be an underpinning commitment of what this shared responsibility and shared obligation profile is.
Mr. Lapson, I think that's a good place for me to finish.
Does that mean I can go?
Not if Dr. Wilson has any questions for you. And he, of course, wants to have the last word.
So the board pleases. Mr. Lapsley, are there any costs yet to be brought to account by which the $32.5 million cost of the firefight will be increased?
I don't know the answer to that, but I would suggest if there are, it's not a major. We won't see another $10 million on top of that. We believe that the 90 percentile or greater is in that figure, but there certainly will be some minor issues to put together. But I think the quantum is close to that figure.
That wasn't so bad, was it? Thank you.
That's it.
No further questions. May Mr. Lapsley please be excused.
Thank you.
We have, just to finish, a few documents to tender and then we'll be done.
Seems that I'm going to get the last word. There's a handful of miscellaneous matters that just have to be tidied up, and I'll just go through them. They're primarily involving tendering documents. There have been a couple of situations that require a little bit of explanation. The first document is the Victorian Workcover Authority's guidance document about reasonably practicable, a document referred to by my learned friend Ms Nichols in questioning, I think, Mr Neast, and I seek to tender that document firstly.
Yes, that'll be Exhibit 96.
The second document is a Safety Management System Manual from GDF Sewers, which has been provided to us and needs to be added to Exhibit 89, which are the other GDF Sewers documents concerning its safety management system. The third matter requires a brief explanation. It will be recalled, seems like quite a while ago, that Mr Reardon, Senior Counsel for GDF Sewers, made a call for a log that may have been maintained by Mr McHugh. Mr McHugh, it will be recalled, was working as part of Mr Jeremiah's incident management team, the Incident Control Centre in Traralgon. It arose in the context of questioning of Mr Jeremiah by Mr Reardon about contact between the mine, particularly Mr Roach, and the Incident Control Centre. Mr McHugh's log has been produced under cover of a letter. The letter from VGSO explains that the log is produced in a redacted form so as to protect the privacy of individuals. Without going into that in any detail at the moment, a course that's been agreed upon with my learned friend Dr Wilson is as follows, that I can indicate, firstly I'll seek to tender the log in its redacted form.
Yes, that will be Exhibit 97.
That's the log of Mr McHugh from the 9th of February 2014. I can indicate, without causing any concerns about questions of privacy, that the log does indicate, or has entries at 3:50pm and 4:05pm, recording contact by telephone between Mr Roach and Mr McHugh. The next document that I would seek to tender is a letter that has just arrived, and I don't even think we've got a hard copy of it, but it's a letter dated the 13th of June 2014 from the VGSO to the inquiry, and it concerns the call that was made, I think by me, of Mr Poll for information about the air monitoring results for the air monitoring that the Department of Education specifically conducted in schools, and I must confess I haven't read that in any detail, but a quick skim of it indicates that it contains that air monitoring data.
Is that the protocol or just the data? I thought there was a request. Sorry, I thought there was a request for the protocol, and it may not matter enough.
I'm sure it matters, but even at 5 to 5 on a Friday afternoon, I'm looking hopefully at Ms Stanson and... Just check. There's a bit of uncertainty about whether the protocol, it certainly includes the data. We'll pursue that with our learned friends about the question of the protocol. But I'll tender that letter. I think that's already been done. The next matter is a supplementary submission that's been provided to the inquiry by the United Firefighters Union, and this is in the context of the Firefighter L issue that has been referred to previously by Council assisting. The further submission was provided to Ms Stanson yesterday under cover of a letter which indicates that Firefighter L is not intending to give evidence at the inquiry, but the supplementary submission does go into some detail about that particular issue. So I'll tender that submission. I think it could be part of exhibit... The UFU submission is already in evidence.
Yes, there's a submission that I've got it down as Exhibit 28.
Yep, I think perhaps if it could be added to Exhibit
Yes.
28, I just want to ascertain.
While that inquiry is being made, we'd like to indicate to the record we've not seen this document. We'd be grateful for a copy.
Yeah, it'll be provided. I thought it had, and we apologise for that. We'll certainly organise that. This is the last thing. Yep. And there is one final document, which is the Hazelwood Mine Fire infrared line scan from the 11th of February, 18th of February, 28th of February and 9th of March at particular identified times. And I think that's the document that we've probably all seen in the foyer of this building on a number of occasions. I'll tender that as well.
Yes, that'll be Exhibit 100. Oh, sorry, you're right. It's 99 because the one was part of 28 before.
We're getting to 100 apparently. Everyone will be very pleased to know. A further email is passing from my left to my right as we speak. Technology in court, it's incredible. And this is a letter I'm instructed relating to a call that was made of Mr Hall of DHS about relocation assistance. So without even having read it, I will seek to tender that. And that, I think, gets us to around 100.
Yes.
And on that note, I think I can indicate that that's the evidence that will be led in the inquiry.
There's nothing more to be said by you, Ms Richards.
There's always something more to be said.
Sure, I can think of something more to say. The plan is to resume here on Tuesday for submissions. I've communicated with the parties about what's proposed for submissions. At present, the indications are that in addition to myself and Mr Rosen, Environment Victoria wants to make submissions that will last about 45 minutes. GDF Sewers wants about 2 hours, as does the state. So we should be able to finish comfortably by our end date, or end point of 3 o'clock on
That's 4 hours and
Wednesday.
45 minutes, and you're going to fit within the
I think
6.5.
I think we will take Tuesday morning.
Sorry?
We will take Tuesday morning. Between
that
the
sounds.
two of
We'll
us.
go into Wednesday.
And we will go into Wednesday, but we will finish by 3 p.m. on Wednesday.
You don't want to say anything to the contrary?
Expression of optimism.
Okay, well, we'll resume at 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning.